Hello, my friends. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support and kind comments. It truly means a lot to me. Before we start, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment. Our goal is 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Your support makes a difference. If you are new here, don't hesitate to subscribe. The Mr. Hex family welcomes you. And now let's begin. My name is Marcus. I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 4 seasons now, and I still don't fully understand why I accepted this position. When the hiring letter arrived at my apartment in Missoula, I remember holding it for 20 minutes before opening the seal. I wasn't running from anything specific. That's what people always assume about men who seek work in remote places, and it irritates me enough that I've stopped correcting them. The truth is simpler and more complicated simultaneously. After my discharge from the National Guard, I spent 18 months in various administrative jobs across Montana, each one suffocating in its own particular way. Cubicles felt like tombs. People felt like interruptions. The world felt too small and too loud. When the Park Service recruitment officer came to the Veterans Employment Fair in Billings, something in her description of the position resonated with a part of me I thought had gone quiet. Solitude with purpose, wilderness stewardship, patrols covering 30,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, no one asking questions about what I did or what I'd seen. I signed the paperwork that same afternoon. The training period was straightforward enough. I learned the emergency protocols, the wildlife management procedures, the seasonal migration patterns of grizzlies and mountain lions. I memorized the trails in my sector and the locations of the emergency shelters. I met the other rangers, most of them professional and distant in the way that people who work in isolation tend to be. My supervisor, a woman named Victoria, was thorough and fair. She mentioned once that I seemed comfortable with silence, which I took as a compliment in her careful way of speaking. What she didn't mention, and what I didn't know until my 3rd week on the job, was that my assigned patrol zone included something the staff discussed only in the ranger station during night shifts when they thought the junior rangers couldn't hear. They called them the high country problems. 3 missing hikers over the past 4 years. 2 more who'd been found in states of severe psychological trauma, unable or unwilling to explain what they'd experienced. 1 hiker, a woman named Judith Preacher, had walked out of the wilderness after 6 days missing and spent the next 8 months in a psychiatric facility before taking her own life. The official reports attributed these incidents to exposure, disorientation, and the inherent dangers of backcountry hiking. The rangers knew better. They spoke about it in careful terms, never quite naming the thing they feared. I listened more than I spoke, a habit from the service that served me well. One of the older rangers, a man called Preston who'd worked the park for 19 years, pulled me aside after a shift. "You're patrolling the north sector," he said. It wasn't a question. "Starting next month," I confirmed. "The lake area. Emerald Lake specifically." "That's part of it, yes." Preston looked away toward the window, where the mountains were catching the last of the day's light. "If you encounter anything unusual up there, if you find yourself seeing something that doesn't quite make sense, you document it and you leave. Don't stay after dark. Don't camp alone in that region. And if you ever see something moving in a way that animals don't usually move, something that looks wrong even if you can't explain why it looks wrong, you don't investigate it further." I asked him to be more specific. "I can't," he said finally. That's the honest answer. No one can describe it in a way that sounds rational, which is why none of it gets reported officially. But I've been doing this a long time, and I know when something is genuinely dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with bears or falls or weather. That conversation stayed with me through the remainder of my training and into those first weeks of solo patrol work. The North Sector is beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people drive thousands of miles to visit national parks. The mountains rise in endless succession, each peak higher than the last, their slopes covered in dense conifer forest that transitions to alpine meadows and then to bare rock and snow. The trails are well maintained, marked with cairns and blazes. Most days I saw other hikers, families with children, photographers, serious backcountry enthusiasts with expensive gear and satellite communicators. But the deep north, the areas beyond the primary trails, the regions where the park became genuinely wild, those places were different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing and your own footsteps in a way that feels like intrusion. Emerald Lake sits in a glacial basin roughly 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by a demanding hike that most casual visitors never attempt. The water is impossibly blue, so bright that it seems almost artificial, fed by glacial melt that keeps it perpetually cold. There's a ranger's cabin nearby, a single-room structure built in the 1970s, equipped with a wood stove and basic supplies. I was required to check the cabin once a month, a 4-day patrol that became the part of my job I both looked forward to and dreaded with equal intensity. That's where I was when things became undeniable. It was late August, the daylight holding until nearly 9 in the evening, when I made my second trip to Emerald Lake. The hike-in had been uneventful, the trail populated with enough hikers that I felt part of something larger, part of the normal world. But as I climbed higher, the number of people diminished. By the time I reached the turnoff for the secondary trail that led to the cabin, I was alone. The cabin itself was unremarkable, weathered to a soft gray by decades of mountain weather. I had a checklist to complete: water supply, propane tank, condition of the structure, any signs of animal intrusion. The work took an hour. Everything was in order. I settled in for the evening with a thermos of coffee and a book, planning to spend the night and return the following day. That's when I noticed the marks on the windowsill. They were scratches in the wood, 4 parallel lines spaced about 3 inches apart. Deep scratches, recent ones, the exposed wood still pale compared to the weathered surface. I ran my fingers along them. They didn't match any normal animal claw pattern that I could identify. Bears would be wider and more chaotic. Mountain lions would leave different spacing. Even a desperate wolverine or lynx would show different characteristics. I examined the rest of the cabin more carefully. There were more marks around the western window frame, and on the back wall near the supply cabinet, someone or something had made deliberate gouges in the wood. Not frantic marks, deliberate, almost methodical. I radioed Victoria at the main station. It took her 15 minutes to respond, the delay caused by the distance and terrain between my location and the main facility. "Marcus, this is dispatch. Go ahead." I reported the marks, trying to keep my voice neutral and professional. I expected her to tell me it was probably old damage, something I'd overlooked during previous inspections. "Acknowledge, Marcus. When did you first notice those marks?" "This inspection. They look recent." A longer pause. Longer than the usual delay that came from distance. "I'm coming to get you tomorrow morning at 0700, Victoria said finally. "Pack your gear for departure." "Is there something wrong? Should I be concerned for safety?" "Just pack your gear. We'll discuss when I arrive." I spent the night with the door locked and the windows checked twice. The wood stove kept the cabin warm enough, but I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair positioned where I could see both windows and the door, watching the light change outside. In summer, the darkness is never complete at that latitude. The sky turns a deep indigo around midnight and begins lightening again by 3 in the morning. But even in that perpetual twilight, the forest feels impenetrably dark. The trees are black, the trails disappear, and the sounds become those that only the deep backcountry makes, sounds without clear sources. Noises that could be wind or water or something moving through the brush 100 yards away. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside that made me reach for the radio. It was a noise that took me a full minute to categorize, a sound like nothing I'd encountered in any of the training materials or in my own experience. It started as what might have been a vocalizing animal, something between a howl and a scream, but sustained at a pitch that kept shifting. It rose and fell in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, almost structured. I've heard wolves and I've heard mountain lions. I've heard bears express distress and anger. This was different. The sound had an intention to it that made my hindbrain respond with pure fight-or-flight adrenaline. The sound came from the northeast, moving gradually westward. The timber on the north side of the cabin is dense enough that I couldn't see whatever was making the noise, and I wasn't certain I wanted to. I called it in. "Dispatch? I'm hearing an unidentified animal vocalization at my location. Duration is 3 minutes and continuing. Moving generally westward at approximately 20 miles per hour. Victoria answered almost immediately. "Marcus, stay inside. Do not investigate. Acknowledge." Acknowledged. Staying put. The sound is fading now. Within 5 minutes, the noise had diminished to nothing. I waited until sunrise to step outside, and even then I went only as far as the cabin's small porch. The forest around me looked peaceful and innocent in the morning light. I saw no blood, no evidence of disturbance, nothing that would suggest anything dangerous had been in the immediate vicinity. Victoria arrived at 0700 exactly, hiking in with a determined pace that suggested she'd started before dawn. She looked at the marks on the windowsill without comment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Pack up," she said. We're heading back. What was that sound last night? An animal of some kind. I've worked predator calls and wildlife management, I said. That wasn't a normal animal sound. No? Victoria agreed. It probably wasn't. The hike back was silent except for the sounds of our footsteps and breathing. When we reached the ranger station, Victoria told me to take the rest of the week off. She would reassign my patrols. If I wanted to talk to someone, she could arrange it. About what? I asked. I'm fine. You heard something unusual. That's enough to rattle anyone, but it was more than just the sound. It was the knowledge that whatever Preston had warned me about was real. It was the understanding that the deep forest held something that didn't fit into any normal category of wilderness threat. And it was the certainty that I hadn't heard anything dangerous in the traditional sense. What I'd heard was something dangerous in a different way entirely, something that knew how to make a sound designed to terrify human beings specifically. That knowledge changed something in me. It was no longer abstract. I spent the next week in my apartment in the small town of Browning, just outside the park. I read everything I could find about Glacier's history, its wildlife, its documented incidents. The official park records were sanitized and professional. The unofficial accounts I found online, in hiking forums and paranormal subreddits, painted a very different picture. There were dozens of first-hand accounts, many of them dating back decades. People who'd encountered something on the trails that they couldn't categorize or explain. A woman who reported seeing a human figure moving on all fours across an alpine meadow at midnight. A group of backpackers who found a campsite that had been surrounded by something, the trees marked in a deliberate circle pattern. Hikers who reported experiencing an overwhelming sense of being watched by something intelligent, something that moved in the dark and knew they were there. The common thread in nearly all the accounts was that whatever people encountered was difficult to describe. It seemed to exist in a category that human language wasn't equipped to handle. People used phrases like wrong and unnatural and not animal, but they couldn't be more specific. Several accounts mentioned the sensation of being in the presence of something that was deliberately mimicking or imitating familiar forms without quite getting them right, like seeing a picture of something you knew well rendered by someone who'd learned about it only from description. One post, from a hiker who'd gone missing for 3 days and been found walking out of the wilderness in a state of shock, described something that caught my attention. He wrote about being followed in the evening by what he thought was another hiker. The figure was a man, roughly his height and build, wearing hiking clothes that looked similar to his own. But every time he looked directly at it, something about its proportions seemed slightly off. The way it moved wasn't quite human, and when he finally fled down the trail in panic, he heard it laughing. Not an animal sound, an actual human laugh, but produced with a resonance that no human throat could achieve. I called Victoria on the Friday of that week. I want to go back to the north sector, I said. That's not happening. You're reassigned to the southern trails for the rest of the season. Victoria, I need to understand what I'm dealing with. You're dealing with a region that has high strangeness, she said quietly. Rangers have learned to manage it by avoiding unnecessary time in the most remote areas. Preston should have explained that better. He tried. But I'd like to know what the actual threat is, what we're avoiding. There was a long silence. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was careful and controlled, the way someone speaks when they're deciding how much truth to tell. There's an animal in that region that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about wildlife biology. I don't use the word should lightly. I have a wildlife biology degree and 15 years with the Park Service. What we encounter up there doesn't follow normal patterns. It's intelligent in a way that exceeds normal animal cognition. It appears to be solitary, though there may be multiple individuals. It's nocturnal or crepuscular, preferring dawn and dusk. It's cautious about humans in groups but will approach or follow individuals or pairs. And you have no idea what it is? None that I can document officially. Unofficially, the local tribes have very old stories about things that live in the high country. Things that can take shapes that are almost human. Things that hunt by exploiting human perception, by making us see what we expect to see rather than what's actually there. The Blackfeet people have been in this region for generations. Their stories predate the park by centuries. I thought about this. You're describing something that's more than just an unknown animal. I'm describing something that the Park Service doesn't have protocols for, Victoria said. We manage it by avoiding it and by discouraging people from backcountry camping in the most remote zones. We do our patrols during daylight, and we don't go into the deep country alone. The missing hikers and the people we found in distress, they violated those patterns. They went where they shouldn't have gone, alone, at times when they shouldn't have been there. What about the tracks? Another silence. You found tracks? Victoria asked. I hadn't, but I needed her to confirm something. I saw references online to unusual track patterns. There have been reports of tracks that don't match known animals, Victoria said slowly. Most of them are inconclusive, but there have been a few that suggest something walking on two legs with a gait pattern that's neither human nor primate. And there was one set of tracks documented in 1998 by a ranger named Cooper. He photographed them before they were discounted as likely hoaxes. Where can I see those photographs? They're in the historical archives. I can show you. She did. The next morning, Victoria met me at the ranger station and pulled up digital scans of photographs taken more than 25 years earlier. The tracks showed something like a humanoid footprint, but the proportions were subtly different from human anatomy. The foot appeared to have a different arch structure, different toe spacing. The stride length suggested something walking upright but with a different posture than human bipedal motion. In one photograph, a ranger's boot had been placed next to a track for scale. The unknown footprint was larger and shaped in a way that no human foot would be shaped. Cooper reported them to Park Administration, Victoria said. The official response was that they were likely caused by a bear or other known animal, though they didn't offer any specific identification. Cooper was quietly transferred out of the park 6 months later. He never worked for the service again. What did he believe he'd found? I don't know. He's deceased now. But based on his detailed notes, he believed the tracks came from a bipedal hominid species, something unrecognized by Western science. He made comparisons to Sasquatch, but he emphasized that whatever was leaving the tracks in Glacier was not the same species. He said it moved differently, hunted differently, and was far more dangerous because it was far more intelligent. I returned to the North Sector patrols 2 weeks later, despite Victoria's reluctance. She eventually agreed on the condition that I carried an emergency satellite communicator at all times and that I would radio in every 2 hours during daylight patrols. I spent 6 weeks working the area, conducting regular patrols and making observations. The hikers on the main trails remained unaffected. The incidents seemed to cluster specifically around the deep country beyond the primary trail system, in the zones where the park became truly wild. In early October, on my 8th patrol to the high country, I began tracking a pattern. I found marks on trees, deliberate gouge marks that couldn't have been made by natural causes. They formed patterns, arranged in ways that suggested intentional marking. Some appeared recent, others older. They created what looked almost like a trail through the forest if you knew to look for it. But it wasn't a trail that matched any hiking path. It moved through terrain that no ranger patrol or normal hiker would traverse. I followed the marks for nearly 2 miles, eventually reaching a location where the pattern changed. The marks became denser, clustered in a specific area. As I approached, I realized I was looking at the remains of a camp, though not a human camp. There was no tent, no visible shelter. But there was evidence of habitation. Stripped tree branches, arranged in patterns around a central area. Bones from various animals, scattered but not in the random way scavengers would arrange them. Pieces of fabric, remnants of hiking gear that had been deliberately torn apart. And something else, human possessions arranged in a line as if put on display. A watch, a wedding ring, a hiking boot, a bandana with someone's initials embroidered on it. I photographed everything and radioed it in immediately. Victoria arrived by helicopter the next morning with a team that included officials I'd never seen before. There was a park superintendent, a man named Hollis, who examined the site with an intensity that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at. There was also a state wildlife official and someone from the Bureau of Indian Affairs who introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Morning Elk. How long would you estimate this has been here? Hollis asked me, examining the bone fragments. Some of this looks years old, I said. Other pieces look much more recent. Maybe weeks. And you found human artifacts, items that appear to be from hikers, missing hikers possibly. Dr. Morning Elk examined the artifacts with careful precision. She photographed them and placed each item in an individual evidence bag. When she picked up the wedding ring, she closed her eyes briefly as if in genuine sorrow. This might belong to Judith Preacher, she said quietly. She was reported missing in 2019 with her husband. He was found after 3 days, severely traumatized. She was never located. The work took hours. The entire site was documented, measured, and carefully collected. When they were finished, Hollis pulled me aside. How much has Victoria told you? he asked. That there's an animal in the high country that's more intelligent and dangerous than normal wildlife. Has she mentioned what the tribal representatives believe it might be? No. Hollis looked out across the mountains, his expression distant. The Blackfeet and the Salish people have stories about beings that live in the highest country. Beings that are difficult to categorize, that don't behave like normal animals. The stories use different names depending on the region and the tribal tradition, but the descriptions are remarkably consistent. They describe something that is partly human and partly something else, something that can shift or change its appearance in subtle ways that affect perception, something that hunts and that is dangerous specifically because it understands how human beings think and perceive the world. Do they have a name for it? I asked. They have many names, but the one you'll hear most often in English is skinwalker. Though that term comes from different tribal traditions and isn't quite accurate, what we're dealing with might be something older and more particular to this region. I stood with that information, feeling its weight settle through me. What do we do about it? I asked. We manage it, Hollis said. We mark the dangerous zones. We restrict backcountry camping. We don't send rangers into the deep country alone. And we understand that there are places in the world that human beings shouldn't go, regardless of how much we might want to explore them. It was October 14th when I decided to camp alone at Emerald Lake specifically to investigate. I didn't ask permission. I simply submitted my patrol schedule indicating I would be doing a multi-day watch on the northern perimeter. Victoria didn't approve it, but she didn't explicitly forbid it either. By that point, she'd accepted that I was determined to understand what I was dealing with. I arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, spending the daylight hours examining the area more thoroughly than I had on previous patrols. I marked the locations where I'd found unusual markings on trees. I established a perimeter around the cabin where I could observe movement. I set up a tripod with a camera and thermal imaging capability, devices purchased with my own funds and installed without official authorization. As sunset approached, the temperature dropped rapidly. The sky turned from blue to purple to a deep indigo that seemed to pull the color out of everything else. The mountains became silhouettes, vast and unknowable. The lake reflected the dying light like obsidian. I was prepared to sleep in the cabin with the door locked and barred. But around 11 in the evening, I heard something outside that made me step onto the porch. The night was clear, the moon nearly full, the starlight incredibly bright at that altitude. Visibility was good enough that I could see the outline of the trail and the trees at moderate distance. I heard movement in the forest to the northwest, something pushing through brush and branches with deliberate, methodical progress. Whatever it was large. Larger than a human by a noticeable margin. I could track its movement by the shifting shadows of the trees and by the occasional glimpse of a massive silhouette. It wasn't moving directly toward the cabin. It was moving parallel to it, following some path known only to itself. I grabbed my thermal imaging camera and aimed it in the direction of the movement. The screen flickered to life, and what I saw made every primitive part of my nervous system activate. The thermal signature showed something roughly humanoid but with proportions that no human possessed. The limbs were longer and thicker. The gait was wrong, moving with a rhythm that suggested a different skeletal and muscular structure than any human anatomy. And there was something about the head, the way the heat signature distributed across it. It was too large, too differently shaped. I watched it move through the forest for perhaps 3 minutes, and then it stopped. The thermal image showed it freezing completely, oriented toward the cabin, oriented toward me. The realization of direct perception hit like sudden impact. Whatever this was, it had realized I could see it, or it had realized I was there. The distinction seemed thin. The thermal image flickered. Then it began moving toward the cabin. I didn't think. I ran back inside and locked the door, barring it with the wooden brace I'd prepared. I doused the lantern I'd lit, plunging the cabin into darkness. I moved to the back corner, where I'd positioned a chair against the corner, giving me a view of both windows and the door. The movement outside grew louder, not frantic. Deliberate. Something large was circling the cabin, testing the structure. I heard what sounded like careful testing of the window frames, a repeated gentle pressure as if something were trying to determine if the barriers could be breached. Then came the sound. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, something I felt more than heard. It built into a vocalization that started as animal but shifted into something different. The pitch rose and modulated in ways that suggested a throat structure designed for something more complex than normal animal communication. And underlying it all was a structure that my brain interpreted as language, even though I couldn't understand the words. It was as if something was speaking in a language that bypassed normal linguistic processing, and went directly to whatever ancient part of my mind still remembered how to respond to predatory vocalizations. The sound continued for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No movement outside, no sound, nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears and my own breathing, rapid and shallow as if I'd been running. I don't remember falling asleep. Exhaustion must have overtaken vigilance at some point. But I woke at dawn with my neck stiff and my heart still elevated, unsure if the night had been real or some fever dream brought on by isolation and stress. The cabin was undisturbed. The door remained locked. There were no marks on the windows or the walls beyond the ones that had been there before. But when I stepped outside to examine the ground, I found tracks, large tracks in the soft earth near the cabin's corner. The prints showed something that had been standing on 2 legs, positioned with a posture that I couldn't quite interpret. The spacing suggested something much taller than human, with a different stride pattern. And there was something else. Deliberate handprints, deep impressions suggesting something had pressed its hands against the cabin wall, testing its integrity. I photographed everything, and I packed my gear. By the time Victoria arrived for the extraction, I had decided something. I would leave the park. Not because I was afraid, though I was. Not because I'd seen something that defied explanation, though I had. But because I'd begun to understand something that Preston and Victoria had been trying to tell me from the beginning. There are places in this world where human beings shouldn't remain for long. Not because of the danger, though the danger was real, but because of what prolonged exposure to those places does to the human mind. The deep forest at Glacier National Park held something that existed in a category beyond the known world, and attempting to understand it or document it or explain it was to risk losing your grip on the rational structures that allowed you to function in human society. As we helicoptered out, I looked down at the mountains and the forest and Emerald Lake, brilliant blue in the morning light. I understood why people went missing in places like that. Not because they were unprepared or unlucky, but because they stayed too long. Because the land itself seemed to have a way of calling to you, inviting you deeper and deeper into its mysteries, until you forgot why you'd wanted to understand it in the first place. I submitted my resignation 3 days later. Victoria accepted it without argument. As I was leaving the ranger station for the last time, she handed me a file. It contained the reports and photographs from the previous incidents. It contained the names of everyone who'd gone missing or experienced severe psychological trauma, and it contained a note in Hollis's handwriting. "You saw something real," it said. "Most people never do. But the seeing isn't the dangerous part. The understanding is. The fact that you chose to leave rather than choose to go deeper suggests you might have better instincts than most of us. Trust that instinct." I drive through Browning sometimes on my way back to Missoula, and I think about that warning. I think about Judith Preacher's wedding ring arranged in a line with other human artifacts, and I think about the sound that had made my nervous system respond with pure animal terror. But mostly I try not to think about the night at the cabin. I try not to think about what was standing outside, testing the barriers, making a sound that my mind still struggles to categorize. Some things should remain unexplained, and some places should remain unknown. That's the only wisdom that the deep country taught me, and it's worth the cost of knowing it. 6 months after leaving the park, I received a letter from Victoria. Another hiker had gone missing in the Glacier North sector. Search efforts had been unsuccessful. The hiker's name was Marcus Chen, 32 years old, experienced outdoorsman. He'd been doing a solo backcountry trek, and his family reported that he hadn't returned as planned. A week after the search was called off, a ranger found him walking out of the wilderness. He was disoriented and unable to account for the time he'd been missing. Medical examination showed he was suffering from severe malnutrition despite having food supplies in his pack. He couldn't explain where he'd been or what had happened to him, and Victoria noted in her letter that he kept asking the same question over and over. Why did it let me go? Why didn't it keep me? She wrote that she thought I should know about this, that perhaps the thing in the mountains wasn't just hunting. Perhaps it was also keeping and observing and learning how human minds worked. I didn't respond to her letter. I didn't ask about Marcus Chen or what became of him after his rescue. Some knowledge is dangerous not because it might harm you, but because you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you didn't possess it. My name is Micah Redwater, and I came to Glacier National Park in late March seeking something I couldn't find anywhere else: erasure. I'd spent the last 5 years in Denver working a desk job for the National Park Service's regional office, pushing papers and attending meetings that meant nothing. My wife had left me the year before, taking our daughter to California. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize, that I was present in body but absent in everything that mattered. She wasn't wrong. I'd inherited that particular talent from my Blackfoot grandmother, the ability to exist in a room while being completely somewhere else. My grandmother used to say that some men are meant to be with the land, not with other people. She died when I was 16, long before I learned to stop fighting against what she saw so clearly in me. For years I thought having a family would change me, that loving someone enough would anchor me to civilization and routine. It didn't. The guilt of my absence ate at me more efficiently than any wildfire could burn through dead wood. When the ranger position opened at St. Mary Lake Station, I applied on a Tuesday and was hired by Friday. My supervisor, Mike Castellano, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a perpetual squint from decades of Rocky Mountain sun, had interviewed me over the phone. He didn't ask many questions. He'd seen my resume, my years of work, my certifications. What he really cared about was whether I'd show up and whether I could handle isolation. "It gets quiet out there," he said. "Not a question. That's what I'm counting on," I replied. He hired me that afternoon. The cabin sat 3 miles north of the lake, accessible by a service road that deteriorated into a rutted track after the first 2 miles. It was a Forest Service structure from the 1970s, authentic, not restoration authentic, but the real deal. 1 bedroom, a main room with a wood stove, a kitchen that still ran on propane, and a porch that faced the tree line. The lake spread out below, visible through a gap in the spruce and pine, dark and cold and beautiful in the way that wilderness is beautiful when nobody's there to need it. I moved in on April 2nd. My truck carried everything I owned that mattered: clothes, camping gear, books, a rifle that hadn't been fired in 3 years, and my grandmother's journal, which I couldn't read but couldn't discard. The job itself was straightforward. I maintained trail systems. I conducted evening patrols. I documented wildlife sightings. I responded to lost hikers and medical emergencies. Spring and glacier meant snow still lay thick on the higher elevations, but the lower trails were accessible by mid-April. Within 2 weeks, I'd be seeing regular hikers. For now, there was only silence and the sound of water moving through snowmelt channels. On my first morning, I walked the perimeter of my assigned territory, about 4,000 acres of backcountry stretching from the lake's northern shore into the high country. The April sun had warmed the air enough that the snow had taken on a crust, and my boots punched through at irregular intervals. I was mapping emergency water sources and checking trail markers when I found something that should have warned me about what was coming. A deer carcass, maybe 2 weeks old, lay near the Miller's Ridge trailhead. The snow around it had melted and refrozen, creating a glassy surface stained dark. What struck me wasn't the death. Predation is constant in the park, but the pattern of the wounds. The deer's hindquarters had been partially consumed, but the upper body was untouched except for deep, raking tears along the spine and ribs. No organized feeding, no pattern I recognized from bears or mountain lions. I took photos and noted the GPS coordinates. When I radioed it in to Mike at the ranger station, he didn't seem concerned. "Probably a wolf kill," he said. "We've got a small population in the northern territories now, still adapting to the ecosystem. Wolves." He was right, probably. The park had been reintroduced with wolves, though sightings remained rare. Still, the carcass bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. The wounds seemed wrong somehow, too frantic, too violent. Predation usually follows a logic of efficiency. This looked like rage. That night, sitting on the cabin porch with strong coffee and a dead cigarette in my mouth, I watched the lake transform in the failing light. The water went from dark blue to iron gray to something nearly black. The tree line became a solid mass against the sky. Somewhere in that expanding darkness, the forest was doing what forests do, consuming itself, dying and rotting and becoming soil for new growth. A sound reached me then, carried on the wind from somewhere north toward the higher valleys. It was distant and impossible to identify. Not a howl, though it held something of that quality, not a scream, but in the same family. It cut off abruptly, like something had interrupted it mid-breath. I stood and listened. The sound didn't repeat. By then I should have left Glacier and gone back to Denver and told my wife she'd been right about who I was. But I was already too far gone into the pattern of my own destruction. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to be where I didn't matter. I wanted to disappear into the landscape the way my grandmother had said some men were meant to do. The forest seemed happy to oblige. By late April, the snow had retreated to the high country, and the trails came alive with hikers emerging from the long winter. The Park Service requires seasonal rangers to conduct evening patrols of popular trails to ensure hikers have exited by nightfall, and to generally maintain ranger presence. It's practical stuff, mostly routine. I'd start around 5 p.m. and walk the main trails until just before dark, checking for abandoned gear or injured persons. On April 28th, a Tuesday, I was walking the Glens Lake Trail when I encountered the first hiker behaving strangely. The trail was about 7 miles round trip, popular but not crowded this early in the season. I was maybe 3 miles in when I saw him, a man in his 60s, wearing clothes that looked expensive and completely inappropriate for backcountry hiking. He was standing motionless in the middle of the trail, staring into the forest at a point where there was nothing but trees. "Evening," I called out. "You doing all right?" He turned to look at me slowly. His face had the slack expression of someone waking from deep sleep. Up close, I could see that his hands were bleeding from small cuts, and his expensive jacket was torn in several places. "I was following something," he said. "Following what?" He gestured vaguely at the forest. It was walking through the trees, moving like it was hurt, like one of its legs wasn't working right. I thought it might need help. I asked him his name, Mark Henson. Where was he camping? He wasn't sure. Did he have a tent with him? No. Water? He patted his pockets as if water might have materialized there and he'd forgotten about it. It was clear that Mark was lost and disoriented, and it was getting dark. I radioed for assistance and got him back to the ranger station where Mike conducted the interview. Mark told a story that, in context, should have seemed completely routine. Hikers get turned around in the woods all the time, especially early season when trails aren't well marked. But his insistence about the animal bothered me. "It was walking strange," he kept saying. "Like the joints were wrong, like it was learning how to walk." We never determined what he'd been following. Probably a deer with an injury, or maybe his mind had just pieced together fear from shadows and half-light. That happens to people in the wilderness. The mind tries to make patterns out of random sensory input, and sometimes those patterns resolve into monsters. But I'd seen the deer carcass. I knew the pattern didn't match normal predation. That week I found another dead animal, and then another. A bull elk with massive puncture wounds that suggested something with teeth far too large to be any predator documented in Montana. A mule deer with its back legs partially dislocated, as if something had been trying to break them deliberately. A young moose calf, maybe 200 pounds, that had been dragged through brush and rock, leaving a trail of blood I could follow for nearly 100 yards. I documented everything, took photos, noted GPS coordinates. When I presented the pattern to Mike, he brought in Patricia Weeks, the park's wildlife biologist. Patricia was sharp and meticulous, the kind of woman who'd spent her life reading the language of the wilderness. She studied my photos and the carcass sites I'd marked, and I watched her expression shift from professional interest to something tighter. "These don't match a predation pattern," she said finally. "The damage is too chaotic, too aggressive, and the distribution, you're seeing kills across a territory spread that's massive for a single predator." "What if it's multiple animals?" Mike asked. Patricia shook her head. "Then we're looking at something with a coordination level that shouldn't exist outside of wolf packs. And wolves are social hunters. These kills have the signature of something solitary. Maybe a rogue bear?" I suggested. "Spring bears are predictable," Patricia said. "They're hungry coming out of hibernation, but they're focused hunters. They know what they want and how to get it." She tapped my photos. "This looks like something that doesn't know what it's hunting for, something just killing." Mike and Patricia exchanged a look that told me they'd been having conversations I wasn't part of. "We'll increase patrols," Mike said finally. "Micah, I want you checking the trail system twice daily, morning and evening, and get those camping closure notices printed. We're going to restrict backcountry access to day hiking only until we understand what we're dealing with." That night, back at my cabin, I stood on the porch and listened to the forest. The April evening was still, the kind of still that seems deliberate, as if something were holding its breath. The lake below reflected the mountain's silhouettes and nothing more. I thought about Mark Henson and what he'd said, about something learning to walk. That was when I heard it again, that sound from the first night, but closer this time. It came from somewhere northeast, up toward the higher valleys where the snow hadn't fully melted. It was longer this time, and it resolved itself into something almost like a scream, but wrong. The pitch shifted in ways human vocal cords couldn't manage. It rose and fell with an unnatural quality that made my teeth ache. Then, underneath the sound, something else, a wet, rhythmic noise. Like something being dragged through water or mud. The scream cut off. The dragging sound continued for maybe 10 seconds and then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual night sounds, the distant movement of animals, the whisper of wind through branches, had ceased. I went inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. May arrived with unseasonable warmth. The snow line retreated further and the park opened additional trails. Ranger patrols increased and hikers returned in larger numbers. For a week I found no new carcasses. The killing stopped, as if whatever had been hunting had moved elsewhere or died or simply lost interest. I allowed myself to think that maybe it was over. Maybe it had been something migrating through, not territorial. Maybe winter had taught it to hunt elsewhere. Then, on May 9th, I found the tracks. I was walking the Eagle's Nest Trail in early morning, checking for overnight hazards. The path was well maintained, moderate difficulty, popular enough that it got foot traffic most days. The previous afternoon, maybe 30 people had hiked it. I had checked it myself at 7 p.m. when I did the evening patrol and found nothing unusual. But in the morning, in the soft earth near Sentinel Creek where the trail widened, I found footprints. They weren't human, but they were close enough to trigger something primal in my response. Each print was roughly 14 inches long, with what might have been 5 toes, arranged almost but not quite like a human foot. The gait pattern was all wrong. The prints showed a stride that suggested a being that was simultaneously walking upright and forward bent, like it hadn't settled on which posture it preferred. There were maybe 20 prints visible before they moved on to harder ground and disappeared. They came from the deep forest, crossed the trail, and continued toward the lake. I photographed every print with a compass and scale for reference. Then I immediately radioed Patricia. "Get off the trail," she said when she understood what I'd found. "Come back to the station. You need to see these." "I will, but get away from there first." It was an odd response, and it generated an urgency I'd been trying to suppress. I moved quickly but carefully back toward my vehicle, watching the forest on both sides of the trail. The morning was bright and clear, the kind of morning that makes predators seem impossible. But predators don't care about morning light. They hunt when they're hungry. At the ranger station, Patricia studied the photos with visible tension in her jaw. Mike was there too, and they seemed to have already been having a conversation before I arrived. "We had a report," Patricia said finally, 2 nights ago. A ranger station about 40 miles north, near Marius Pass. They found a hiker dead. Initial assessment was animal attack. My stomach turned. Why wasn't this broadcast to all stations? "Because," Mike said carefully, "the ranger who found the body wasn't sure what he was seeing. He flagged it as a potential grisly kill, but the behavior didn't match. He wanted to investigate more thoroughly before raising a panic." "What's the ranger's name?" I asked. "David Reeves. He's been stationed at Marius for 5 years. He's reliable." "Is he?" "He's fine. He's the one who found the body and reported it. But Micah, the kill pattern..." Patricia pulled up images on her laptop. "It matches your carcasses, but worse. Human worse." The photographs showed what had been a man maybe 40 years old. What remained of him was extensive enough to identify cause of death without ambiguity. Something had systematically dismantled him. The violence was thorough and patient. "The body was found off-trail about a mile from the Maria station," Patricia said. "Not someone unprepared, not someone hiking after dark. Just someone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place." We filed a report with regional headquarters. A bulletin was issued warning of unusual animal activity. The park increased ranger presence and a game warden named Roy Mathis came out with tranquilizer equipment and tracking dogs. For 3 days, Roy and Patricia tried to establish what had killed the hiker. They followed the trail from the body, mapped the surrounding territory, searched for dens or signs of denning behavior. They found nothing. No shelter. No pattern of movement. No evidence that anything had been living in that region long term. "It's passing through," Roy said when they gave up. His voice carried professional frustration. "Whatever it is, it's not territorial. It's moving, but moving where? If it was heading south or west, it would eventually encounter civilization, towns, more people. If it was moving toward Glacier's interior, toward the backcountry where I spent most of my time, that was a different problem." That night, I sat in the cabin and opened my grandmother's journal. I've never been able to read Blackfoot fluently. My mother had assimilated too thoroughly, hadn't maintained the language, but I could parse some of it. My grandmother's handwriting was precise, and some entries were in English. One passage, dated 1987, caught my attention. She'd written about something the old people talked about, something that came down from the far north in the worst winters. She'd written, "Wayne-you, the thing that calls in the dark." My grandmother said it came only when something was broken in the balance, a place where the animals were confused, a place where the rules had shifted. She'd written more, but the rest was in a dialect I couldn't parse. Still, the words stuck with me. "Wani-you, The thing that calls. I'd heard something calling. By mid-May, the situation had become tense in a way the Park Service couldn't officially acknowledge. Internally, rangers talked about closing major trails. The biologists discussed bringing in federal wildlife specialists. Media had started sniffing around the David Reeves kill, and it was only a matter of time before the story broke nationally. But nothing happened on the surface. The park remained open. The hiking trails were managed but not closed. Ranger presence increased, but it was done subtly, presented as routine maintenance rather than protective response. I continued my patrols, but I'd changed my routes. I avoided the deep backcountry, stuck to trails with regular foot traffic. I carried the rifle now instead of leaving it at the cabin. I'd also started sleeping less, or maybe differently. I'd lie in the cabin and listen to the forest throughout the night, conscious and awake, aware. It was on May 17th that Kristen Ashford disappeared. Kristen was a junior ranger, 24 years old, on her first season at Glacier. She was competent and thorough, the kind of person who did everything right. She'd been assigned to do a maintenance sweep of the Lower Grinnell Falls Trail, a popular day hike about 9 miles total. She'd gone out at 7 a.m. with radio communication and a partner system. She'd check in with dispatch every 2 hours. She checked in at 9 a.m. She didn't check in at 11 a.m. By noon, Mike had organized a search team. By 1 p.m., we were covering the entire trail system between her last known position and the trailhead. By 6 p.m., we'd expanded the search area to include backcountry territories she shouldn't have wandered into. We found her radio near the trail, about 1.5 miles from the trailhead. It was sitting on a rock, placed deliberately, not dropped. The battery was still active. We found her jacket about 50 yards away, torn and covered in something dark. We never found Kristen. The Park Service couldn't hide it anymore. Federal agencies got involved. The story hit the regional news and then national news. Outdoor magazines ran features. Social media erupted with conspiracy theories and explanations. Someone suggested a serial killer. Someone else proposed a genetic throwback. Some kind of cryptid population hidden in the northern Rockies. Some people claimed it was vindication of decades of Bigfoot reports. The National Park Service responded with what it does in these situations: official statements, investigation protocols, and pragmatic decisions. They closed the park's backcountry trails. They limited day hiking to specified routes with mandatory ranger escorts. They brought in more federal wildlife specialists, more federal investigators, but nothing they did made a difference because they were treating it as a conventional problem, and it wasn't. The night after Kristen disappeared, I heard it again. The sound from the darkness, but this time it was much closer, probably not more than 1 mile from the cabin. And this time I heard something else beneath it. A human voice, not screaming, just speaking, almost conversational, words I couldn't quite make out. I grabbed the rifle and a flashlight and went outside. The night was moonlit, the lake below reflecting silver light. I stood on the porch and aimed the flashlight toward the forest, toward where the sound had come from. The beam caught trees and undergrowth, shadows within shadows. The voice stopped. For a long moment there was absolute silence. Then something moved through the trees at the forest edge, about 200 yards from the cabin. I aimed the flashlight at the movement, and what I saw made me take a step backward. It was roughly humanoid, but nothing about it moved like a human moves. The gait was jerky and uncertain, as if whatever controlled the limbs wasn't sure how many there were or where they should go. It was pale, so pale it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and it was carrying something that might have been Kristen's body, draped over its shoulder like a fresh kill. I brought the rifle up, safety off. But by the time I had a sight picture, it had moved back into the forest and was gone. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, breathing hard, watching that spot. Then I went back inside and locked the door and radioed it in. What I reported to Mike and the federal agents was carefully edited. I said I'd seen movement in the forest that might have matched something large. I'd seen what might have been a large animal moving away from the cabin. I mentioned the humanoid shape because there was no way to not mention it, but I framed it in terms of tricks of light and moonlight perception. They brought search teams to my area the next day. They found tracks in the soft earth, and those tracks matched the ones I'd documented on the trail. They found what looked like blood smears on some of the trees, and they found Kristen eventually in a shallow ravine about 2 miles north of the cabin. What they found was enough to confirm death, but not much more. The body had been partially dismembered and exposed to scavengers. The condition made detailed analysis of what had actually killed her nearly impossible, but I knew I'd seen it. The Park Service closed Glacier to the general public on May 21st. It was the first time a national park had been forcibly closed for an active predatory threat since the reintroduction program began. The news was everywhere. The governor called for a full military response. Conspiracy theorists had field days. The academic community split between those suggesting genetic anomalies and those claiming hoaxes. Federal wildlife teams swept the park with equipment and personnel I'd never seen deployed. They brought in helicopter infrared imaging. They used drone technology. They set traps and monitoring systems. They tracked and photographed every animal in the northern sections of the park. They found nothing. The killing stopped, just like they'd stopped after the Reeves incident. Whatever had been hunting seemed to simply cease activity when we increased our response. It was almost as if it understood that too much attention was dangerous, that it needed to let the pressure ease before it could hunt again. I was pulled from field work and assigned to the ranger station as a coordinator. Mike wanted active rangers in positions where they could provide real-time support to the federal response. I spent my days in the office, tracking reports and managing communications. But at night, I went back to the cabin. The rangers offered to relocate me, but I refused. In a way I couldn't articulate, I knew leaving would make it worse. The presence in the forest had marked my territory, and abandoning it felt like a challenge it would accept. In my time at the cabin, I'd gone back through my grandmother's journal more carefully. Using an online translation tool and what fragments of the language I could recall, I'd pieced together what she'd been recording. She'd documented stories from elders about creatures that appeared when the natural order had been disrupted, when humans had taken more than they should, when the forest itself had become confused about the rules. She'd written about a thing that called from the darkness, something that wasn't alive in the conventional sense but wasn't not alive either, something that existed in the spaces between. She'd written that it only came where there was deep forgetting, where people had forgotten the relationship between themselves and the land. She'd written that to be a person who knew those forgotten things was dangerous. It made you visible to what moved in the darkness. On May 29th, 9 days into the closure, federal investigators released a statement. They'd identified the creature based on track evidence and behavioral patterns. It was, they concluded, likely an undocumented predator, possibly a genetic variation of a known North American species with behavioral anomalies that made traditional responses ineffective. It was bureaucratic language for "we don't know what it is." The practical response was to extend the closure indefinitely. Ranger presence would continue. Federal response teams would remain staged at various points in the park. Monitoring systems would be maintained. Mike called me into his office on June 2nd. He was tired, the kind of tired that comes from responsibility and uncertainty. "You can transfer," he said without preamble. "Most rangers are. We're offering relocation to any park where you want to work. Denali, Yellowstone, any of them." I didn't answer right away. "I'm staying," I said finally. "Micah, I came here for a reason. I'm not done with whatever that reason was." Mike studied me carefully. "That thing killed a ranger. It might kill another one. Are you really ready for that?" "I don't think it wants to kill me," I said. "Why would you think that?" I thought about the night I'd seen it carrying Kristen's body. I thought about how it had moved back into the forest when I aimed the rifle. I thought about the precision of its movements, the intelligence behind them. "Because if it wanted to, I'd already be dead," I said. After I left Mike's office, I drove out to the cabin and sat on the porch as darkness fell. The lake was still, a perfect mirror of the mountain's shapes. The forest was quiet in the way that meant something was listening. I opened my grandmother's journal to an entry from 1989, one of the last ones she'd written. "Some men are made to be boundaries between worlds. It's not a thing they choose, it's what they are. My grandson has this quality. I see it in his eyes. He will find a place where the walls are thin, where what moves in darkness wants to be seen. He will stand there even when it frightens him. This is what some men are for." I closed the journal and walked down to the water's edge. In the darkness, something moved through the trees on the opposite shore. Not hunting, just moving, watching, existing. I thought about Kristen and the hiker at Marius, and all the animals whose bodies had told the story of something learning how to be predatory in this specific part of the world. Something that had come when the balance shifted, when too many humans had taken too much without understanding what they were taking from. My grandmother had written about being a boundary. I understood now what that meant. I would stay at Glacier. I would keep my patrols and my reports and my documentation. I would be present in the places where the thing that called in the darkness moved through the trees. And I would bear witness to the pattern even if I couldn't explain it, even if no one would believe me, because some knowledge exists only in the spaces between worlds. And some men are made to know those spaces. The thing in the forest would hunt again when it needed to. The cycle would continue in the way cycles do. But for now, in the June night, it simply watched from across the water, and I watched back. The lake reflected nothing but darkness now, and the mountains had become invisible against the sky. In that absence of light, in that deepening of shadow, something like understanding settled over me. I was finally exactly where I was supposed to be. I took the job at Glacier because I needed to disappear. That's the truth of it anyway. The official story I gave the Park Service was different. I told them I wanted to work in wilderness management, that I'd always felt called to conservation work, that I had genuine experience in backcountry operations from my time in the Army. All of that was technically true, but it wasn't the reason I drove 18 hours straight from Denver to the ranger station at Many Glacier, why I accepted the seasonal position for a wage that barely covered my truck payment, or why I chose the remote station at Kintla Lake, 7 miles from the nearest road by trail alone. I came because my marriage had dissolved into something unrecognizable, because my wife and I had spent 4 years unable to have the conversation that might have saved us. And by the time we tried, there was nothing left to save, because I couldn't look at the house we'd bought together, couldn't drive past the restaurant where we'd met, couldn't sit in a bar without analyzing every interaction through the lens of failure, and because I'm the kind of person who, when the ground gets unstable, walks deeper into the wilderness instead of calling for help. Cota Blackthorn, my supervisor, hired me on a Friday in late August. Cota was Blackfeet, in his 60s, with a slow way of talking that made you feel heard even when you knew he was assessing every word you said. His office was a prefab structure near the park entrance, surrounded by filing cabinets and photographs of bear attacks, flood damage, and rescue operations spanning 40 years. "You understand, you're not in the Army anymore," Cota said, pushing a clipboard across his desk. "This work is different. Nobody's shooting at you, but the land doesn't forgive mistakes. Weather changes in 20 minutes. People get lost. Predators take livestock. You see something out there that seems wrong. You don't try to be a hero. You document and report." "I understand," I said. "Do you, though?" He leaned back in his chair. It creaked. "Because most people who take remote assignments are running from something. That's fine. The wilderness will take your mind off most things, but it creates other problems. Isolation does things to people, things they don't expect. The longer you're alone, the more you start seeing patterns that aren't there. Hearing things. The nights are long out here." I didn't respond. He was right, of course. But right didn't change the fact that I needed to be alone. The cabin at Kintla Lake sits at 5,100 feet elevation, accessible by a trail that descends through dense lodgepole and whitebark pine. It's a solid structure, built in the 1970s and maintained reasonably well. Solar panels on the roof, a propane stove, a small generator for the radio and battery chargers. No internet. Sporadic cell service if you climb to the ridge behind the property. The lake stretches out below, dark water reflecting the Mission Mountain Range, and beyond that the backbone of the Continental Divide. The assignment ran through October. After that, the station would be locked up for winter, the trails officially closed, the ranger presence pulled back to the valley. September was already cool, the days noticeably shorter. By early October, the aspens would be turning. By November, snow. I had 2 months to become someone else. I moved in on a Thursday. My possessions fit into the bed of my truck. Some clothes, books, a 12-gauge shotgun and ammunition in case of bear problems, binoculars, a journal, a coffee maker I'd owned since 2008. That was my life now. The first 2 weeks were almost pleasant. I fell into a rhythm. Morning patrols along the North Trail checking for downed trees and trail damage. Afternoon observations from the ridge, counting elk herds and looking for signs of wildfires. Evening maintenance on the cabin, splitting wood, organizing supplies. I kept a detailed log, filed reports, responded to Cota's weekly radio check-ins with professional brevity. I didn't think about Denver, I didn't think about Amanda, I didn't think about anything except the work. But Cota was right about the isolation. It starts small. You hear a sound in the forest at night, and you wonder what made it. You see movement at the edge of your vision, and you turn, but there's nothing there. These things happen in any remote location. But when there's nobody else around to verify your experience, when you can't call someone and say, "Hey, did you hear that weird noise?" and have them normalize it, the strangeness accumulates. By late September, I'd started keeping a log of unusual observations. I told myself it was professional, documentation of anomalies in wildlife behavior. But the truth was closer to what Cota had warned about. I was noticing patterns. There was the elk herd that abandoned their usual grazing area near the South Fork. When I investigated, I found their prints scattered through an area normally they avoided, near the steeper slopes where the footing was poor. No signs of predation, no evidence of why they'd moved. They were just gone from the good land. There were the ravens. I'd watched birds for years, and ravens fascinated me. Intelligent, social, responsive to their environment. But in early October, I observed a pattern of behavior I couldn't explain. At dusk, they'd circle the lake in a specific pattern, moving counterclockwise as the light faded. They did this every evening for a week. Not eating, not vocalizing, just circling, wings catching the last light until it got too dark to see them anymore. Most disturbing were the tracks. I found them on October 3rd, near the water's edge on the eastern shore, about a quarter-mile from the cabin. I was checking the water intake for the system, a large pipe that drew from the deeper part of the lake, and I saw the prints in the mud. They were human in shape, size approximately my own, maybe slightly larger. But the depth and pattern were wrong. The heel print was much deeper than the forefoot, as if someone had been walking with excessive forward lean. And there was something else. Where fingers would have pressed into the mud, there was a different kind of mark. Longer. Not webbing exactly, but something that suggested the hands were wrong. I took photographs with my phone, noted the GPS coordinates, and hiked back to the cabin with my heart rate elevated higher than the walk warranted. That evening, I radioed Cota. "I found tracks," I said. "Eastern shore, near the water system. Humanoid, but unusual." Silence for a moment. Then, "What kind of unusual?" "The gait suggests a forward-leaning posture. The handprints don't look normal." More silence. In the background of his radio, I heard papers shuffling. "Could be a black bear walking upright. They do that, especially if they're approaching something." "Did you see claw marks?" "I don't think so. I took pictures. The proportions are more like a person than a bear. Could be vagrant. Sometimes people hike in from neighboring properties. Could be a poacher. Could be someone lost. You should hike back out tomorrow with those photos. Show them to me in person. In the meantime, lock the cabin. Keep the shotgun handy. Don't approach anything that looks human." "Should I be concerned?" "Always be concerned in the wilderness," Cota said. "That's the mindset that keeps you alive. But don't panic. Most dangerous things in these mountains make themselves known before they hurt you. It's the ones that sneak that you need to worry about." He didn't elaborate on what might sneak. That night I could hear the wind moving through the pines, a sound like distant water. I'd brought books but couldn't focus on reading. I kept checking the windows, which was stupid, because the glass just reflected the cabin interior back at me, making it harder to see outside. I finally accepted the darkness, poured whiskey into a mug of bitter instant coffee, and sat on the porch with the shotgun across my lap. The thing about isolation is that it makes you attentive in ways you don't expect. Your hearing becomes more acute, distinct. You can differentiate between a branch falling and something walking through deadfall, between wind moving through evergreen branches and something breathing in a measured way. Around midnight, I heard something moving through the forest on the ridge above the cabin. Not an elk. The pattern was wrong. Too deliberate. Four-legged, possibly. Or something using four limbs and alternating with two. The sounds were intermittent, long periods of silence punctuated by the scrape of something against bark, the crack of a branch. I went inside, locked the door, and positioned myself so I could see through the window without being silhouetted by the cabin's interior light. The thing moved along the ridge for nearly 2 hours. I heard it circle the cabin, coming close to the western wall, then moving back away. At one point, I heard what might have been breathing, deep, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the south side, near the water system. When dawn came, I felt the exhaustion crash into me, but I forced myself to move. I pulled the curtains, made coffee, and prepared the cabin for the 5-mile walk back to the ranger station to show Cota those photographs. But before I could gather everything, he radioed. "We have a missing hiker," Cota said. His voice was different, professional, clipped. "Report came in late last night from the west side, group of 4 out of Gunsight Pass. One member separated from the party around 2 p.m. They've been searching but found nothing. Weather's turning. I'm assembling a recovery team. I need you to watch the perimeter trails. Check the crossings toward Ptarmigan Lake. I'm sending Marcus up to your location to cover the eastern valleys. Hiker's name is Derek Wells, 26, from California. Any sign of him on your trails, you report immediately." "Understood," I said. The rest of the conversation was logistics. By afternoon, Marcus, a younger ranger from the valley station, arrived on horseback with supplies and a detailed map of the search grid. "Cold front coming in tonight," Marcus said, studying the sky. "Temperature could drop to the 20s by midnight. If this guy's out in the open, separated from his group, he's in serious danger." "What's his experience level?" "According to his friends, he's done decent backcountry work in California. But that doesn't mean much. Everything's different up here. Elevation, the way weather moves, the animal behavior." We organized the search methodically. Marcus would cover the valleys to the north. I would patrol my assigned trails and keep watch on the perimeter. We'd meet back at the cabin at dusk and reassess. The missing hiker's name was Derek Wells, and I would later learn that the circumstances of his disappearance contained details that didn't quite align with what his group reported. But that came later, after I'd found things in the woods that changed how I understood what was possible. Derek Wells had left Gunsight Pass around 1 p.m., according to his companions. They were attempting the Gunsight Lake Trail as a day hike, a 9-mile round trip that climbs 3,000 feet. One member had developed knee problems, so Derek volunteered to hike ahead to scout the route and return with information about the remaining distance. He didn't return. The official assumption was that he'd taken a wrong turn, gotten disoriented in the forest, and wandered in the wrong direction. This happened regularly. Hikers underestimated the visual similarity between sections of mountain wilderness. They made decisions based on incomplete information, took turns that seemed right, and ended up miles off course. Usually they were found within a day or two, cold, exhausted, sometimes injured from falls, but alive. But the peculiarity of Derek Wells's disappearance was that his friends had heard him scream approximately 40 minutes after he'd left their position. This detail came out gradually through the emergency frequencies and ranger radios. The first report had been vague. A hiker had become separated and wasn't responding to calls. But when Marcus and I started comparing details while organizing the search, the picture became stranger. "They heard him scream," Marcus said, reading from a printout Cota had transmitted. "Not yelling, not calling for help. Actual screaming. And then when they hiked up to investigate, they heard him screaming from a different direction. They got confused about where the sound was coming from." "That's possible," I said carefully. "Sound moves weird in these canyons, reflects off rock faces. Possible." But his friend said the screaming seemed more intense on the second instance, and then it just stopped. Like it was cut off mid-sound. I didn't respond. I was thinking about the tracks I'd found, about the thing moving through the forest above my cabin, about Cota's warning that it was the ones that sneak you needed to worry about. The search continued through the afternoon. Marcus and I covered trail miles, looking for broken branches, torn clothing, disturbed ground, any sign of the missing hiker. We found nothing. By evening, the temperature was dropping, the wind picking up, and the sky had taken on the peculiar quality it gets before snow. "Fronts moving in faster than predicted," Marcus said when we regrouped at the cabin around 6 p.m. "I'm heading back to the valley to report in. Cota wants to mount a night search with more personnel, maybe bring in dogs." "You're staying here?" "Assignments to monitor the perimeter stations." "Right. Well, lock the doors, carry the shotgun. It's becoming night search territory, which means the animals are active, and we've got an unstable hiker somewhere out there. Unstable as in panicked, disoriented, possibly injured. That combination makes people unpredictable." After Marcus left, I prepared the cabin. I loaded the shotgun properly, secured ammunition, filled thermoses with coffee, and settled into a position near the window where I could see the lake and the forest beyond. The night came dark and complete. No stars because of the cloud cover rolling in. The wind picked up around 10 p.m., harsh enough that it moved branches on the largest trees. Snow started around midnight, not heavy, but steady, the kind that would accumulate quickly. I kept the radio on low volume, monitoring the search frequencies. Teams had been deployed to 3 locations. A helicopter with thermal imaging would attempt the search at first light. If Derek Wells was alive out there, the thermal would find him. Body heat registers clearly against the cold environment, even if a person is trying to hide. Around 2 a.m. I heard something outside. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate, something moving close to the cabin. I stood and moved carefully to the window, keeping my body behind the frame so I wouldn't be visible from outside. The snow had created a thin blanket over the ground. The light was such that I could see shapes, the outlines of trees, the fence line I'd repaired the previous week. There was a figure standing near the water system. It was bipedal, roughly human in shape, but the posture was profoundly wrong. It stood with its back unnaturally curved, its arms hanging lower than they should, Even in the poor light, I could see that it wasn't standing still. It was swaying, rocking its weight from one leg to the other with a rhythm that suggested compulsion rather than comfort. I raised the shotgun to my shoulder. The figure's head turned toward the cabin. I could see the white of its face in the darkness, too white, as if lit from within or covered in snow. But the snow had only been falling for hours. How would something accumulate that much if it was moving? I fired. The report of the shotgun in the enclosed space of the cabin was deafening. I immediately cycled the action and fired again through the window, the second shot exploding the glass outward in a burst of ice-cold air. The figure was gone. I moved to the door, chambered another round, and yanked it open, my eyes straining against the darkness. The snow was undisturbed. Whatever I'd fired at had left no visible impression, no blood, no body. For the next hour, I stood with the door open, the shotgun ready, listening to the wind. The snow continued to fall. The thermal mass of the cabin gradually dissipated into the night, my breath creating clouds that froze in the cold air. Eventually, I closed the door, secured it, and radioed the emergency frequency. "This is Ranger Mills at Kintla Station. I discharged the shotgun in defense of the cabin. Potential threat assessed as unknown origin. Possible trespasser or wildlife behavior. Investigation by armed ranger inconclusive." The response was standard. They asked if I'd been injured, if I needed extraction, if the threat remained. I answered no to all three. They noted it for the log and advised me to maintain position and communication. I didn't tell them that I'd seen something that shouldn't exist. The rest of the night passed in a state that wasn't quite sleeping, wasn't quite waking. I'd doze, then snap alert at sounds that usually meant nothing. The wind moved the doorframe slightly. A branch scraped the roof. Twice more I heard movement outside, but I didn't fire again. The ammunition was limited, and using it on shadows wasn't prudent. When dawn came, Marcus rode back to the cabin. "Jesus, what happened here?" he said, surveying the broken window and the bullet holes in the wooden frame. "Something was outside. Wasn't responding to warning. I discharged." He dismounted and examined the ground more carefully than I had. The snow had accumulated another 4 inches overnight. If anything had been moving, it would have left tracks, but there were none. Just virgin snow, unmarked except where my footprints showed where I'd stepped outside. "Didn't hit anything," Marcus said. "No. Wildlife? Possibly. Didn't get a clear visual." Marcus didn't push. Rangers understood discretion. We understood that some things that happened in the wilderness didn't have clean explanations, and reporting every ambiguity created friction with administration. "Search and rescue found something," Marcus said. "About an hour ago. They're bringing the body down now." "Derek Wells? Don't know yet. They're not saying. But there was a body, and it's in rough condition. Cota wants you at the ranger station to give a formal statement about your activity last night. I'll stay here, keep watch. You should head out." The 5-mile hike down took an hour. I moved quickly, passing Marcus on horseback, and making good time to the trailhead parking area where a vehicle was waiting. The ranger station had become a command center. Multiple vehicles were parked outside, and inside I found Cota in a conversation with a person I didn't recognize. "This is Detective Louise Simmons, County Sheriff's Department," Cota said. "Derek Wells's body was recovered by the search team this morning. He'd been dead approximately 12 to 14 hours. The county's opening an investigation." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What happened to him?" I asked. Simmons and Cota exchanged glances. Cota spoke. "His body was found about 3 miles northeast of Gunsight Pass, which is in the opposite direction from where he would have walked if he'd been trying to return to his group. His body showed signs of multiple injuries. The coroner hasn't made preliminary determinations yet, but it appears he may have been attacked." "By what?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Simmons said. She was a woman in her 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd worked outdoors most of her life. The wounds are inconsistent with the predators we typically see in this range, not characteristic of bear attack. The injuries are more consistent with something using sharp implements, claws, possibly teeth, but the pattern suggests multiple separate attacks, or a single assailant that attacked repeatedly from different angles. I thought about the figure at the water system, about the way it had stood, rocking with that inhuman rhythm. "You said his body was found near Gunsight," I said. "That's miles from my station." "We know," Cota said. "Your incident from last night is being treated as separate, but you need to give your statement for the record." I provided the statement. I described hearing movement, seeing a figure near the water system, firing in defense. I didn't describe the figure's posture or the way its face had seemed to glow. I reported the facts that could be verified: the broken glass, the ammunition fired, The lack of visible threat after investigation. When I finished, Simmons asked a question that stuck with me. Have you observed anything unusual in the forest in the time you've been at this station? Unusual behavior from wildlife? Signs of unauthorized persons? Strange tracks? Anything that seemed odd? Nothing conclusive, I said. But something you're uncertain about? I hesitated. But Cota was watching me, and I understood that what happened next would depend on my answer. Unusual tracks, I said. Near the water system. They appeared humanoid but with unusual proportions. I documented them with photographs. Can you show me? Simmons asked. We reviewed the photographs on my phone. Simmons studied them carefully, her expression unreadable. When did you find these? She asked. 3 days ago. And you reported them? To Ranger Blackthorn. Simmons looked at Cota, who nodded confirmation. I want to examine the site, Simmons said. Today, if possible. Ranger Mills, you'll guide me. The hike back up was tense. Simmons was efficient and professional, but I could feel her assessment of me, trying to determine if I was reliable or if I was someone prone to panic and false reports. The tracks were still partially visible beneath the new snow. I showed her the exact location where I'd photographed them. She examined the area methodically, taking her own photographs, measuring the prints with a scale she carried. You said you found these 3 days ago, she said. October 3rd. Early morning. Before or after Derek Wells disappeared? After. His group reported him missing around dusk. Simmons stood and looked toward the lake, then back at the forest. She seemed to be calculating something. Distances, timelines, the relationship between separate events. Ranger Mills, she said finally. Is there anything else you've observed that made you uncomfortable? Anything besides the tracks and last night's incident? I thought about the elk herd abandoning their usual grazing area, about the ravens circling the lake every evening in that strange pattern, about the sound of something moving through the forest above the cabin, something that alternated between 4 limbs and 2, something that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence. The wilderness is unsettling, I said, more than I expected. It's difficult to differentiate between legitimate threats and the way isolation creates perception. That's honest, she said. Most people won't admit that. Cota warned you about this, didn't he? He mentioned that isolation affects perception. It does. But sometimes what you're perceiving is real. The trick is learning to separate the two. She pocketed her phone. We should head back. We'll start an expanded search in this area, and you should consider taking an extended break from the station. Your nerves are already taut. Having a body discovery in the forest near your location is going to intensify that. Having a second person on site might help. Ranger Marcus is already staying at the cabin. Make sure he stays. Don't spend nights alone out here until we close this investigation. We hiked down as the afternoon light started to decline. The snow continued, steady and relentless, erasing details and creating a world of white and gray. Derek Wells had been 26 years old, a software engineer from San Jose. He'd been hiking in Glacier with 3 companions who'd met him in a hostel in nearby Kalispell. They were casual hikers, tourists experiencing the park, not people prepared for the remoteness of Gunsight Lake. The coroner's preliminary report, which Cota shared with me 2 days later, indicated that Wells had sustained injuries inconsistent with accidental death. The wounds included lacerations on both arms, deep puncture wounds on his torso, and evidence of blunt force trauma to his skull. The coroner noted that the patterns suggested an assault by something with multiple sharp protrusions, claws or teeth, and strength sufficient to inflict significant damage. The official conclusion was that Wells had been attacked by a large predator, most likely a grizzly bear, despite the unusual wound patterns. But Detective Simmons disagreed. A bear attack leaves a different signature, she told me when we spoke on the radio the following day. Claw marks are distinct. These injuries are more consistent with something that uses its hands to hold and its mouth to bite. And there's another element. Predators don't typically attack multiple times and then leave their prey. They feed or they leave. This victim was attacked in a pattern that suggests prolonged interaction. I didn't voice what I was thinking. That whatever had taken Derek Wells wasn't interested in feeding. It was interested in something else. Marcus and I maintained the cabin together through the remainder of October. He slept on the small cot in the storage room. We maintained guard and shifts, though neither of us admitted that we were afraid. We told ourselves it was protocol. We told ourselves it was precaution, but both of us heard things. The movements in the forest above the cabin became more regular. Most nights, we could track something moving along the ridge, always at the edge of visibility, always just too dark to identify. It never approached directly. It seemed to be surveying, mapping the space, learning the patterns of the cabin's operation. More disturbing were the sounds that might have been vocalization. They weren't howls, not quite. They were something between vocalizations, rough, rhythmic sounds that seemed to come from multiple points simultaneously. Not echoing, but separate instances of the same basic sound, as if multiple things were calling back and forth to each other. "We should talk about what's happening," Marcus said on the 8th night of his stay. We were sitting on the porch, both armed, watching the forest. "What do you think is happening?" I asked. "I think something is coordinating. I think it knows we're here. I think it's deciding what to do about that. That's projection. We're scared. Our brains are looking for threats, maybe. But the tracks you documented, the body they found near the pass, the sounds we keep hearing, those are all real things, not perception. Real." I couldn't argue with that. We sat in silence for another hour, watching the darkness move. Around 1 a.m., I heard something that made both of us go rigid. A voice, clear, distinct, and unmistakably human. It was coming from the direction of the forest to the north, perhaps a quarter-mile away. "Hello," the voice called out. "Hello, someone there?" Marcus and I exchanged glances. He was already standing, shotgun ready. "Possible lost hiker," he said. "Or bait," I replied. We debated for perhaps 30 seconds, which is an eternity when someone's calling for help. Protocol said we should attempt to locate and assist, but everything about the situation felt wrong. The timing, the clarity of the voice cutting through the forest, the way it seemed designed to bring us out into the dark. "This is Glacier National Park Rangers," Marcus called back. "Remain where you are. We're coming to your location." The voice didn't respond again. We prepared ourselves as thoroughly as possible, loaded the shotguns, checked our radios, locked the cabin, and moved toward the sound's origin with flashlights and weapons ready. The forest at night with an active search is disorienting. The flashlight creates a tunnel of visibility that's both helpful and limiting. Beyond the light's reach is absolute darkness. We moved slowly, and after perhaps 15 minutes we found the clearing where the voice had come from. There was nothing there. No body, no abandoned gear, no signs of disturbance. The snow was undisturbed except for our own tracks coming in. "It called us out here," I said. "Yes." We didn't discuss further what that meant. We hiked back to the cabin and locked ourselves inside. The radio crackled early the next morning. Cota's voice, tight with controlled stress. "We have another incident. About 4 miles south of Kintla, near Ptarmigan Lake. A ranger from the east side was doing equipment maintenance. He's not responding to radio check-ins. His vehicle is at the trailhead, but there's no sign of him on the trail. I'm assembling a search team. Ranger Mills, you'll remain at your station. Keep the radio on and monitor perimeter." His name was David Summers. I knew him slightly, a competent ranger, experienced in backcountry work. In his 50s, the kind of person who wouldn't get lost or disoriented. The kind of person who would answer a radio unless something prevented him. By evening, they found his body. Like Derek Wells, Summers had sustained injuries that suggested an animal attack, but with inconsistencies that troubled the investigators. Unlike Wells, Summers had been found at the location of his equipment maintenance. He hadn't been moving away from safety. He'd been killed at his work site, in a location he'd visited dozens of times, in the middle of the day. That night, Detective Simmons came to the cabin personally. "I'm pulling both of you out," she said to Marcus and me. "As of tomorrow, this station is being closed temporarily. The Park Service is suspending backcountry work until we establish what's happening here. You'll return to the Valley Station." "There's a storm coming," Marcus said. "Tomorrow's hiking weather will be worse than today's." "I'm aware. We'll have a vehicle here at dawn. You'll pack personal gear and any important documentation. Everything else stays." After she left, Marcus and I moved through the cabin mechanically, gathering our possessions. Neither of us wanted to articulate what had become obvious, that something in these mountains had learned that humans represented opportunity, that it had tested our responses, the way it had called in a human voice, the way it had moved with intelligence and observation around the cabin. And now, with 2 bodies and a search pattern interrupted by its presence, it seemed to be escalating. I packed my journal, the photographs I'd taken, and the one piece of information I'd been documenting that I hadn't shared with anyone, the pattern of the animal movements, the places where predator sign had appeared, and the concentration of unusual activities around the lake. When I mapped it mentally, it formed a shape, a territory, something that had defined boundaries around the Kintla Lake area. And within those boundaries, it was establishing dominance. The next morning, a vehicle arrived as promised, and we left the cabin locked and silent. I didn't return to Denver. I couldn't. The thought of the house we'd shared, the empty rooms, the photographs of happier years, it was more than I could face. Instead, I transferred to a ranger position in the valley for the remainder of October and early November. I maintained my presence in the park, but I was in the lower elevations, surrounded by more people, more infrastructure. It didn't stop what was happening. It just changed the location. 2 weeks after we abandoned Kentla Station, a hiker was found dead near Bear Hat Lake, about 6 miles south of where I'd observed the unusual animal movements. The pattern of injuries matched the previous victims, the animal, or animals because I was beginning to believe it was multiple coordinated individuals, was moving south, following the valleys. I reviewed everything I knew. The tracks with their wrong proportions, the figure at the water system that had seemed to glow with an internal light, the vocalizations that sounded almost human, the way livestock and wildlife in the area had abandoned normal behaviors, the intelligence and how the creature or creatures had tested the cabin's defenses, the way they'd called out in a human voice to see how we'd respond. I went to Cota's office and requested a private meeting. "I think I know what we're dealing with," I said. Cota gestured for me to sit. He was older than he'd seemed during my hiring interview. Tired, carrying weight I'd attributed to age but which might have been worry. "Go ahead," he said. The tracks I documented had unusual proportions. Humanoid, but with wrong arm length, wrong hand structure. The attack patterns don't match known predators. The vocalizations that rangers have reported don't match any species in this region. And the behavior, the way it's testing, learning, coordinating, that's not animal, that's intelligent. "What are you suggesting?" Cota's voice was careful. "I'm suggesting that what we're dealing with is something outside normal taxonomy, something that's been in these mountains long enough to understand human behavior, human infrastructure, something that hunts humans specifically." Cota was quiet for a long moment. "There's a reason I hired you," he said finally. "You had military experience. You don't scare easily. I thought that would be valuable for this position. You knew something was here." I suspected. There have been incidents over the years, missing hikers, unexplained deaths, attacks that didn't align with known predator behavior. Each incident was documented as animal attack, bear predation, accident. But the pattern was consistent with something else. Something that exists in the margins of what we officially acknowledge. "What is it?" I asked. "The Blackfeet call it many things. The oldest name is starvation that walks. In Algonquin languages it's Wendigo. The stories describe an intelligence that lives in the deep places of the forest, that hungers not just for food but for something in the human experience. These mountains have always been places where that thing claims dominance. For long stretches it seems dormant, but sometimes something awakens it. Too many people in the forest. A shift in the animal's migration, starvation in other territories, and then it emerges." "You're saying this is real?" "Actually real. I'm saying that what's official and what's real often aren't the same thing. The Park Service won't acknowledge this because it contradicts their mandate to maintain Glacier as a safe recreation area. The county won't investigate beyond animal attack conclusions because the alternative is unmanageable. And so the thing that lives in these mountains remains unnamed, unacknowledged, and free to continue what it's always done." I thought about Derek Wells, about David Summers, about the terror they'd experienced in their final moments, confronted with something their minds couldn't process or categorize. "How do we stop it?" I asked. "We don't," Cota said. "We live in its territory. We acknowledge its presence by our absence. The indigenous peoples understood this. Certain lands were left uninhabited. Certain seasons were forbidden for certain areas. They maintained a relationship of respect and avoidance. But your people came and built vacation lodges and maintained trails and insisted the entire landscape was available for recreation. That was the mistake. That's what brought the increased attention of the thing that hunts here. So we just let it kill people? What do you suggest? An official hunt. Resource expenditure to pursue a creature that by every metric of science doesn't exist. The Park Service wouldn't authorize it. The county would categorize you as a conspiracy theorist. And the thing itself, it's perfectly adapted to these mountains. It has advantages in terrain, concealment, and tactical knowledge that we can't overcome." I left his office in a state of profound disturbance. Part of me wanted to dismiss what he'd said as the delusion of an aging man too long in the mountains. But another part, the part that had heard things in the night and seen impossible tracks, believed every word. By mid-November, the Park Service had quietly closed all backcountry trails north and east of Lake McDonald. The official reason was seasonal closure in advance of winter weather. The actual reason was that they were containing an area they couldn't explain and couldn't acknowledge. I submitted my resignation at the end of November. My final night in Montana, I sat in a hotel room in Kalispell and reviewed my journal from the entire assignment. I'd documented everything, the tracks, the unusual animal behavior, the deaths. I'd included quotes from Cota about local folklore and historical incidents. And I'd added my own assessment. Whatever was in those mountains, it was intelligent. It was predatory in a way that transcended simple feeding behavior, and it was becoming bolder. I could have tried to publish the information, but I knew how it would be received. Dismissed as speculation, categorized as pseudoscience, or worse, taken seriously enough that it created hysteria and unauthorized hunting expeditions that would accomplish nothing except more deaths. The silence felt complicit, but it also seemed like the only rational choice. I'm writing this now, 6 months later, from Denver. I returned to the house. Amanda didn't ask if I wanted reconciliation. We'd both moved beyond that. But we've achieved something close to a functional partnership. Civil, respectful, capable of discussing logistics without hatred. It's not the marriage I'd wanted, but it's better than the wreckage it became. I took a position with a geological survey company that does mapping work on public lands. It pays adequately, and it keeps me outside, though in lower elevations and populated areas. But I still read the news from Glacier. In February, a backcountry skier was found dead near the Alpine Meadows, approximately 20 miles south of Kintla Lake. The body showed injuries consistent with predator attack. In April, 2 people died in what was ruled as a bear attack near Mount Jackson. Last month, a solo hiker was found with fatal wounds near the Many Glacier Hotel, less than 2 miles from the main visitor center. The Park Service has increased ranger presence and implemented new trail closure protocols. They've brought in bear behavior specialists who've concluded the injuries suggest unusually aggressive bears responding to environmental stress. The official narrative is holding, at least publicly, but I've been in contact with Cota via email. The activity hasn't decreased. If anything, it's accelerated. The creatures are moving closer to civilization, testing boundaries, learning patterns, understanding what they can sustain without triggering serious intervention. Marcus quit his ranger position and moved to Oregon. I learned this through a mutual acquaintance. He doesn't respond to emails, and I don't blame him. Some experiences leave permanent marks. I'm writing this account now because I want documentation to exist, not for public consumption or investigation, that would be irresponsible, but so that if someone, somewhere, needs to understand what's possible, this record is available, so that the next ranger who experiences the inexplicable, who hears something in the darkness that doesn't fit taxonomy, who discovers tracks that suggest something impossible, that ranger will know they're not losing their mind, that they're experiencing something real, something that exists in the margin spaces of the world, something that Cota was right about. The wilderness is a place where human authority is provisional. We make our maps and post our signs and build our infrastructure, but we're ultimately occupying territory that was here before us and will be here after us. And in the remotest sections, in the places we rarely visit, in the canyons and ridges and deep forests, there are things that remind us of that fundamental truth. I accepted the job at Kintla Lake because I wanted to disappear. I got what I wanted. I disappeared into something larger than myself, something that changed how I understand the world. I don't recommend it, but if you find yourself in those mountains in the remote sections, particularly as winter approaches, remember that you're not alone. Remember that intelligence exists in forms you won't recognize. And remember that sometimes, in the darkness, the best choice is to not be curious about what calls to you from the forest. The best choice is to remain in the light, with other people, and never, under any circumstances, answer when something speaks to you in a human voice from the places where humans shouldn't be able to survive. Some boundaries should never be crossed. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear, not in the sense of dying or killing myself. I mean disappear from the life I'd built in Denver, from the woman I'd hurt, from the job I'd failed at, from the person I'd become in the city. I was 34 years old and felt like I was drowning in concrete and compromises. When the National Park Service posted the seasonal ranger position in northern Montana, something in me recognized it as an exit, a clean way out. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been working the backcountry for 6 seasons now, but that first winter in Glacier was different. September through March, most rangers clear out. The snow gets too deep, the trails become impassable, and the park effectively shuts down except for essential maintenance. The job I accepted was exactly that, essential maintenance. monitoring the few cabins that stayed open year-round, checking on equipment, maintaining emergency shelters, and most critically, conducting periodic welfare checks on the few researchers and hermits stubborn enough to winter in the high country. The park had assigned me to Raven Lake Cabin, a structure built in 1967 that sat at 7,000 feet, surrounded by old-growth subalpine forest. The cabin itself was solid enough: log construction, a working wood stove, cots, emergency supplies. From the cabin's northern window, I could see the lake frozen solid by November, its surface white and featureless as a sheet of paper. My supervisor, a woman named Christy who'd been with the NPS for 20 years, warned me about the isolation. People think they understand solitude, she told me during my orientation in late August. They read books about it, romanticize it. But winter solitude here is a different animal. You're going to be 40 minutes from the nearest town by snowmobile, no cell service, radio only, and that's temperamental above 5,000 feet depending on weather. If something happens, medical emergency, equipment failure, psychological crisis, you're managing it alone for potentially days. I told her I understood. I meant it. What I didn't understand was the silence. Real silence isn't peaceful. Real silence has weight. It presses down on your ears until you can hear your own blood moving through your veins, until you become hyper-aware of every small sound your body makes. Your breathing becomes loud. Your heartbeat becomes a metronome in your skull. The drive up the mountain on September 20th took most of the day. Fall was still holding in lower elevations, but by the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin access road, I could see snow lingering on the highest peaks. The forest around me was beginning its transition, some aspen already golden, pine needles darker and more concentrated without deciduous competition. I remember thinking that it was beautiful, the way you think something is beautiful right before it scares you. My wife back in Denver had asked me what I would do all winter. Read, watch what little television the satellite provides, maintain logs, hike when conditions allow. Think, I told her. The last word hung between us. She knew what that meant. It meant thinking about us, about the reasons I'd come home late too many nights, about the younger woman at the firm, about the conversation she'd overheard, about the lies I'd told. I wanted distance. I wanted snow between us. The cabin was stocked with provisions, canned goods, freeze-dried meals, batteries, fuel, first aid supplies. A radio mounted on the wall connected me to the ranger station in Kalispell, though the reception was unreliable. There was no electricity except what a small solar panel could provide, and that would become increasingly inadequate as days shortened. I had a generator for backup, but fuel was limited. Christie's final instruction was simple: use it only if necessary, and check on that fresh water supply. The spring that feeds the interior line sometimes freezes despite the insulation. I spent my first week settling in, cataloging supplies, testing equipment, hiking the perimeter to assess the immediate forest. The silence was there from the beginning, but it didn't feel wrong yet. It just felt like absence, like the world had moved away and left me behind. By mid-October, the first significant snow fell. I watched it come in from the west, a gray wall advancing across the distant mountains. By the time it reached the cabin, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 yards. The snow fell wet and heavy, accumulating at a rate I could almost perceive, even while watching. Within 4 hours, we'd gotten nearly 18 inches. Within 20, we'd gotten 2 feet. I spent that day tending the fire, cleaning the cabin, reading an old paperback I found in a desk drawer. I tried the radio around noon. Christie's voice came through, distorted but intelligible. "Marcus, you reading me? We're showing that system moving through your area. Reading you fine," I said. "Already got about 2 feet here. Good. Secure anything that needs securing. We might have communication blackouts for a few days. If you need anything urgent, file it in your logs and we'll coordinate once weather clears." When the snow finally stopped the following morning, the silence was absolute. I stood outside the cabin and I heard nothing. Not wind, not animals, not water. Just the occasional soft drop of snow sliding off the cabin roof. That was when the footprints appeared. I nearly dismissed them as my own at first, but I quickly realized they covered the entire perimeter of the cabin. Something had walked around the structure multiple times during the night, leaving deep impressions in the soft snow. The prints were large, easily 7 or 8 inches long, spaced widely as if made by something with an extended gait. Not a human, possibly a moose, though the pattern seemed wrong for that. Too deliberate, too circular. I followed them into the forest, where they became difficult to track against the deeper snow beneath the trees. But what I could see suggested the creature had circled the cabin no fewer than 4 times, always staying roughly 30 feet from the structure. That concerned me more than a single pass would have. Multiple circuits meant observation, planning. That night, I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, though I knew that was pointless if something truly wanted entry. I kept the fire going, which meant staying partially awake, monitoring the flames. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something moving outside. Not the sound of an animal investigating, something more deliberate. Footsteps, the crunch of snow under steady, measured weight. The footsteps circled the cabin once, slowly, then moved away toward the forest. By November, the pattern had become routine. Something visited the cabin every few nights, circling, pausing at windows, sometimes standing still for periods of time. I began leaving the interior light on, courtesy of my carefully rationed generator fuel. I reasoned that if the creature could see inside, it would be less likely to investigate. I don't know if that logic was sound, but the visits didn't escalate into anything more aggressive than surveillance. The thing that got to me was the silence between visits. When nothing moved outside for days, I found myself almost hoping for the sound of footsteps. The absence became worse than the presence. I would lie in bed listening so intently for movement that my ears would create sounds that weren't there. By December, I'd stopped filing regular reports with Christy. I told her everything was secure, supplies were good, no issues detected. I lied about what I was experiencing, the way you lie to doctors when you don't want them to take something away that you've come to depend on. The hunger had started by then. Not physical hunger. I had enough food, but a different kind. A need to confront whatever was moving around the cabin, to understand it, to know what I was sharing this small circle of light with in the winter darkness. That impulse, I would later understand, was exactly what it wanted. The second week of December brought a warm front that melted much of the snow to a crust, then a sudden cold snap that froze everything solid. The landscape became a vast mirror, pale and reflective, and in that clarity, I could finally see the footprints clearly. They were humanoid. That was the most disturbing aspect. Not human, but close enough that my brain recognized the basic structure. 2 legs, asymmetrical spacing, a gait that suggested bipedal movement, but the proportions were wrong. The stride was too long, the indentations of what might have been fingers or claws extending from the front of the prints as if the creature was pulling itself forward rather than walking. The prints appeared on December 8th, leading from the forest directly to the cabin, then circling the structure 3 times before returning to the forest. But this time, they didn't emerge from a direction I could track, they simply appeared. The first point of impact was against the north wall of the cabin, as if the creature had materialized there. I measured them, 13 inches from heel to toe. The impressions were deep enough that I could see the soil beneath the snow, compressed and darkened. Whatever made them had significant weight and force. That afternoon, I left the cabin, my first journey into the forest in weeks, to see where the prints led. I should have gone back. I should have radioed for assistance. But the real job of being alone in the wilderness, was beginning to feel like a test. A test of whether I could survive not just the physical challenges of winter, but the psychological weight of isolation and the unknown. The prints led northeast, toward the ridge that overlooked Raven Lake. I followed them for perhaps a quarter mile, watching as they moved between stands of whitebark pine and subalpine fir. The forest was dense there, the kind of place where snow accumulated heavily in the branches and visibility was reduced to yards. I could see how easy it would be to walk past something in there. How easy it would be for something to watch you walk past it. The prints ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, despite my weeks of hiking. The clearing was circular, perhaps 100 feet across and completely bare of snow despite the recent weather. Not just clear, the ground was bare earth, dark and visible against the frozen landscape. In the center of this clearing, the tracks spiraled inward in a pattern that made me dizzy to look at. I stood at the edge of the clearing and felt something shift in my understanding of the park. The clearing wasn't natural. There was no reason the snow should melt there while remaining inches deep everywhere else. There was no geothermal activity at Glacier, no hot springs in this region. The ground itself felt wrong, colder than it should, if that makes sense. As if the earth beneath that clearing had a temperature independent of the season. I didn't enter the clearing. Some instinct, more acute than normal thought, prevented it. Instead, I marked the location in my mind and returned to the cabin, moving through the forest as quickly as I could manage in deep snow. That night, the circling resumed. I could hear it from inside the cabin, the steady crunch of footsteps pacing the perimeter, but there was something different about the quality of the sound. It wasn't avoiding the cabin anymore, it was testing, pausing at windows, pressing against the door. Once I heard something that might have been breathing against the glass, a wet sound that lasted several minutes. I realized, with a clarity that cut through my isolation-compromised reasoning, that I was afraid. Not the academic, intellectual fear of danger, the primal, animal fear of being hunted, of being regarded by something intelligent and predatory. The next morning, I forced myself outside and looked at the prints from the night before. They were different from the previous patterns. These tracks showed that the creature had stopped at each window, pressed hard enough that the snow was compressed into ice. At the main door, the prints showed a series of impacts as if the creature had struck the wood repeatedly. More disturbing, embedded in the snow at the door, I found something. A piece of fur, dark and matted, caught on a splinter of the doorframe. I collected it carefully, using a stick to place it in a plastic bag without touching it. The fur was coarse, almost wiry, and it had the smell of something dead. Not recently dead, but not entirely fresh either. A smell like roadkill after a season of weather exposure. I tried the radio. Static answered. I tried again. "This is Webb at Raven Lake Cabin. I need to request assistance. Something is in the forest. I'm not sure what, but..." I paused. "How do you explain this? How do you tell someone that you've found evidence of a creature that shouldn't exist?" Christy would think I was having a psychological breakdown. Possibly she'd be right. I've found evidence of an unknown animal, large, possibly dangerous, requesting a supply drop or a ranger visit when weather permits. Static, no response. I tried again every hour for the rest of the day, nothing. Either the radio was truly broken, or the weather was genuinely blocking transmission, or the signal was being blocked by something else. That thought came unbidden, and I hated myself for entertaining it. Primitive thinking. The thinking of someone losing the distinction between rational assessment and paranoid fantasy. By mid-December, I had a choice to make. I could attempt the hike out. The snow was manageable if I was careful, and I could reach the ranger station in approximately 8 hours of steady walking. I could report what I'd found, show them the fur, explain the patterns I'd observed. They would send someone back with me, probably with equipment to track whatever was in the forest. They would solve the mystery. Or I could stay. I could continue watching, continue learning, continue whatever dialogue was occurring between me and the thing outside. I stayed. The job, after all, was to maintain the cabin and conduct welfare checks. I was conducting the most important welfare check of my life, on myself, on what I was becoming in this place where nothing was certain and everything pressed in from the darkness. By December 22nd, the darkness had become nearly complete. The sun rose around 8 in the morning and set before 4 in the afternoon. The hours between were gray and diminished. The forest around the cabin existed in a state of permanent twilight, and the creature adapted perfectly to those conditions. It came closer now. It no longer circled at a distance. Instead, it stood at the windows. I could see the shape of it sometimes, a silhouette darker than the darkness outside, pressed against the glass. It never seemed to have eyes that I could identify, but I felt observed with an intensity that physical sight couldn't explain. I found myself talking to it, not in any conscious decision to do so, but as a natural response to the pressure of that observation. I would sit by the window with a cup of coffee and speak to the shape outside. "I know you're there," I said one afternoon. "I know you've been here every night. I don't know what you are, but I'm not leaving." The shape at the window didn't move, but the silence that followed felt like acknowledgement. "I came here to escape," I continued, "to stop being someone else's idea of what a person should be. Maybe that's what you do. Maybe you help people stop being things. Maybe you're the reason people disappear in these mountains." I wasn't sure if that was true, but as I spoke, something began to make sense. The wilderness kills people every year, some through accident, some through exposure, some through misadventure, but the reports always get filed. The bodies always get recovered, or the assumption is made. The system at least maintains a record. What if there were disappearances that never made the report? What if something in these mountains had learned how to erase people more completely than any accident could? "I'm not afraid of you," I told the shape at the window, and I was lying. I was terrified, but I was also curious in a way that seemed to cut deeper than fear. That night, the creature did something new. It came to the skylight, a transparent panel set into the cabin's roof. I heard it climb, heard the sound of claws or something claw-like, scraping the metal rim. Then it pressed itself against the glass, and I could see it from below. The shape was vaguely human, but translated into something else. The proportions were stretched. The arms too long, the torso too thin, the head too large. The face was turned away from me, but I could see the back of its skull, and it took me several seconds to process what I was looking at. The back of its head moved. Not with breath, but with something internal shifting beneath the skin, as if something was moving inside its skull. Something separate and distinct from whatever the outer form was. I think I screamed. I'm not entirely sure. The sound I made wasn't purely mine. It came from somewhere deeper than conscious intention. The creature pulled away from the skylight, and the night returned to its ordinary darkness. I spent the rest of that night with every light in the cabin burning, eating through my generator fuel like a losing man betting on his last hand. Christmas passed. I don't think I truly acknowledged it except to note the date on the calendar. The outside world, the world of holidays and human marking of seasons, felt impossibly distant. The only calendar that mattered now was the creature's calendar. The only season was hunting season. By December 28th, I had stopped sleeping in the conventional sense. Instead, I existed in a state of constant low-level vigilance, catching moments of rest when my body demanded it, but never fully disconnecting from the awareness of what moved in the darkness outside. This state of mind creates a particular type of hallucination. You see things that aren't quite there. You hear suggestions of sounds that might or might not have occurred. You lose the ability to distinguish between what you've perceived and what you've imagined perceiving. This is important to understanding what happened when I went to Raven Lake. The lake, which I'd never actually seen except from the cabin window, called to me in a way I couldn't fully explain. Not the lake itself, but something in that direction, a pull that felt less like choice and more like magnetism. On December 29th, with the temperature at -18 degrees and a wind that made anything exposed ache within minutes, I prepared for a hike down to the lakeshore. I'm aware now of how irrational that decision was. I left a radio message on the emergency frequency, something incoherent about investigating anomalies. I left the cabin stocked with wood and water. I took minimal gear, as if part of me knew the hike was one way, as if I was testing whether I truly wanted to return. The descent took 3 hours. The forest path was familiar from my earlier hikes, but the winter had transformed it into something alien. The snow was deep, and walking through it was exhausting work that quickly consumed my body heat despite multiple layers. My breath frosted my face, the moisture in my lungs crystallizing with each inhalation. By the time I reached the lake, I was hypothermic enough that I should have been incoherent. Instead, I was thinking with painful clarity. Raven Lake, frozen solid, was the color of old bone. The ice was thick enough that I could walk across it, and the surface, scoured by wind, was clear enough to see into the water below. What I saw there remains the image most burned into my memory from that entire period. Bodies, or what remained of bodies. They floated perhaps 10 feet down, suspended in the water as if the lake had paused in the act of consuming them. I could count at least 4 distinct shapes arranged in a pattern around the lake's deepest point. 2 appeared to be entirely intact, dressed in clothing that looked decades old. The others were in states of decomposition, barely holding their human shape. One of them, the clearest, had empty eye sockets that seemed to look directly up at me. The clothing was from the 1970s, I think. A park ranger's uniform, decayed but still recognizable. I don't remember falling to my knees, but I remember the cold of the ice against my legs and the sound of my own voice making noises that didn't form words. I remember the awareness that I was looking at the solution to disappearances, at a collective grave maintained by something that had been feeding here for decades, possibly longer. Then I heard the sound of movement on the ice behind me. I turned to find the creature standing perhaps 50 yards away. In daylight, the details were clearer and more horrible than they'd been in darkness. The thing was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with a frame that seemed to be built from angles rather than curves. Its skin, what I could see of it, had the consistency of leather that had been left in the sun for years. The head was disproportionately large, with features that suggested age beyond measure, deep crevices around what might have been a mouth, eyes that were entirely black and completely still, but the most striking aspect was its stillness. The creature wasn't reacting to my presence in any visible way. It simply stood, watching, and in that complete lack of reaction I perceived something far worse than aggression: indifference. The indifference of something so far removed from human emotional context that my presence barely registered as noteworthy. I should have run. Instead, I found myself speaking. "The Rangers," I said, my voice rough and barely functional. "The hikers. The people who disappeared. They're here." The creature didn't respond. It tilted its head, a movement that was somehow more disturbing than any threatening gesture could have been. "Why?" I asked. "Why here? Why them? What does it mean?" The thing took a step forward. The ice beneath it didn't crack, but I heard it shift, heard the subtle groan of frozen water adjusting to new weight. When it took another step, I realized it was moving toward me with purpose. That broke my paralysis. I ran. The journey back to the cabin is something I've tried to reconstruct and something I've tried to forget. Both instincts are equally strong. I know I fell multiple times. I know that at one point I was moving through forest that didn't match the path I'd taken down. I know that I saw something in the trees, another shape, moving parallel to my flight, and that I was no longer sure if I was being chased by one creature or many. I burst through the cabin door and collapsed inside, my body giving out completely as shock and cold and fear drained the last of my reserves. I lay on the floor and shook with the kind of violence that came from somewhere beyond conscious control. When the shaking stopped, hours later, I had crossed some threshold. The rational part of my mind that had been maintaining the pretense of normal function simply ceased to operate. What occurred in the following days feels like memory from someone else's life. I didn't leave the cabin. I didn't check the water. I didn't maintain the fire with consistency. Instead, I existed in a state of waiting. The creature was still there, I knew. I could sense it even when I couldn't see or hear it. It had moved from circling the cabin to inhabiting the space around it. The forest itself felt like its body, extended and present. On the fourth day after my trip to the lake, the cabin filled with a smell, not the previous roadkill smell, but something else, something ancient and fermented, like the exhalation of something that had been holding its breath for years. I found the source at the north-facing window. The creature had pressed its face against the glass so completely that the glass was frosted over with condensation and something else, a viscous substance that slowly ran down the pane. I realized with a horror that cut through my dissociation that it was trying to break in, not violently. It wasn't hitting the window or attempting to break the glass. Instead, it was pushing against it slowly and steadily, and the wood around the frame was beginning to buckle. The nails were creaking. The latch was bowing. Within another day, perhaps less, the window would fail. I should have boarded it up. I should have used the tools and materials I had available. Instead, I walked to the window and opened the latch myself. The creature's face was inches from mine. I can't describe it adequately. The features were almost human enough to be recognizable and entirely alien in their combination. The eyes were completely black but not empty. Something was in there. Some attention, some awareness, some form of consciousness that existed on a spectrum I couldn't measure. Why? I asked again. That seemed to be the only word left to me. When it spoke, the voice was not sound in any conventional sense. It came from inside my head, and it was old. Not just the age of an old voice, but the age of an old language being translated into concepts my modern brain could barely parse. Hunger makes many choices, it said, or communicated, or forced into my mind. The forest is one, the people are another. The winter is all. The winter is always all. The people at the lake, I said. What were they? Necessary, it said. As you are necessary. As all things are necessary when hunger calls them. I understood then. The thing wasn't malicious in any sense I could comprehend. It wasn't evil. It was simply operating at a remove from human morality or understanding. It was a force, and forces don't justify their operation through ethics. What do you want from me? I asked. The creature didn't answer directly. Instead it gestured, a movement that took its arm and extended it across an impossible distance, showing me something. The gesture revealed a fundamental aspect of the world that I hadn't previously perceived. I saw the cabin as it truly was, not a shelter, but a collection point. The lake below, not a natural feature, but a storage facility. The forest around me, not vegetation, but skin. The whole landscape was the creature, had always been the creature. Every mountain, every tree, every water source was part of something so vast and old that the concept of individual agency became meaningless. We are one, it communicated. The wood and the snow and the stone and you, all moving toward the same place. All hunger becomes the same hunger eventually. I should have been more afraid. I should have rejected this understanding. But in that moment, I felt something break in me that broke in a relieving way. The effort of maintaining the distinction between self and environment, between inside and outside, between survival and surrender, simply ceased. What do? I asked. You wait, it said. You remain. You become necessary. Christy found me on January 7th. Not found. That's not the right word. Discovered. Encountered. The snow had stopped falling for 2 days, and the ranger service was finally conducting welfare checks after the long communication blackout. She came by snowmobile with another ranger, a younger man named Robert. And they both had that particular expression that comes from seeing something that doesn't fit into normal experience. I was standing outside the cabin, half-clothed, waiting. I don't remember how long I'd been there, possibly hours. My body temperature should have dropped enough to cause incapacity, but I didn't feel cold. I felt like I was becoming part of the cold, the distinction blurring. "Marcus," Christy said, and I heard the effort it took her to keep her voice normal. "Get inside. Get warm." I didn't move. I was looking at Robert, and I realized that something was happening in the forest behind them. A shape that might have been the creature, but might have been something else, was moving through the trees. They hadn't seen it yet. "There's something you should know," I told her, "about the park, about the forest. It's not—" I didn't have words for what needed to be said. "It's not what you think it is." Christy took a step toward me, and I saw her assess my state. Hypothermia, malnutrition, psychological deterioration. All of the warning signs that came with extended isolation. "We're getting you evacuated," she said. "Right now, nothing else matters." They brought me inside, forced warm drinks into me, wrapped me in blankets. As they were preparing the snowmobile for the return trip, I watched the forest. The shape I'd seen was gone, or it was no longer visible, which amounts to the same thing. "Did you see anything?" I asked Robert. "In the forest, on the ride up." He hesitated. Christy shot him a look that kept him from answering fully. "We saw some large prints," he finally said. "No identification, something big. It wants you to know it's there," I said. "That it's always been there. It's not attacking anyone because it doesn't need to attack. It's already inside everything. The park, the lake, the mountain. It's patient. It hunts according to seasons we don't measure." Christy didn't respond. She was speaking into her radio, requesting immediate evacuation by helicopter if possible, given the apparent psychological breakdown. I don't think she was being unkind. She was following protocol, doing her job. "But I need the lake," I told her. "Raven Lake. You need to check the lake. There are bodies, old bodies, Park Service, from decades back. Everything that disappeared in this region." She looked like she was taking this seriously for a moment, and then the moment passed. The look she'd seen in my eyes had confirmed what the rest of my appearance suggested. I was not a reliable source of information. I was a mind that had fractured under the pressure of isolation. "Marcus," she said gently, "we're going to get you to a hospital, get you properly evaluated. Everything's going to be fine." Everything was not going to be fine. But there was no point saying so. The helicopter arrived within 4 hours. They loaded me aboard with minimal commentary, and I spent the ride watching the landscape recede. The mountains became smaller, the forest became a texture, then a pattern, then just color. By the time we reached the hospital in Missoula, the cabin was too far away to see it all. The hospital kept me for 3 weeks. Psychiatric evaluation, physical recovery. They conducted interviews where I was strongly encouraged to reframe my experiences as psychological episodes rather than genuine encounters. They ran tests. My body was in relatively good condition despite the ordeal, which confused them. The hypothermia exposure should have caused more damage. The malnutrition should have been more severe. I recovered physically with unusual speed. The psychiatric evaluation was less successful. They wanted me to acknowledge that the creature was a manifestation of stress and isolation. They wanted me to accept medication. They wanted me to build a narrative where everything I'd experienced was the product of a fractured mind under pressure. But I had physical evidence, the fur, still in the plastic bag I'd collected it in. I gave it to them and they ran tests. The results came back inconclusive. The material was organic, but the DNA didn't match any known species in their database. It showed some similarities to canine and some to primate, but also markers that matched nothing in the comparative sequence bank. They told me it was contaminated. They told me the sample was too degraded to draw meaningful conclusions. They told me what I needed to hear, not what they actually found. Christy came to see me the week before my release. She brought information about the lake. "We had divers go down," she said. "You were right, there were bodies. 4 of them. The oldest was a ranger from 1983. The others spanned back further than that. Some we haven't identified yet. The cause of death is unclear, but there's evidence of submersion over a period of years. The cold water preserved them." "What about the others?" I asked. "There have to be more." "Possibly," she said. "But bodies in deep water, they sink, they settle. We got what we could recover. It's being handled as a criminal investigation now, but given the timeline, the likelihood of solving anything is low." "It killed them," I said. "We don't know that," Christy replied. They could have fallen through the ice, could have gotten disoriented and walked into the lake. The circumstances are unclear. They were ranger station employees, right? All of them? Mostly, she acknowledged. But again, unclear circumstances. Could have been accidents, could have been policy failures from decades ago that no one remembers now. We both knew what that meant. The Park Service was going to file these deaths in the past, file them as cold cases that wouldn't be solved. Not because they couldn't be solved, but because acknowledging the actual cause would require acknowledging something that couldn't be addressed or fixed. When I was released, they gave me resources, a therapist to call, a support group for wilderness trauma survivors, medication that I agreed to but never filled. They said I could return to work in a supervised capacity, but they recommended at least a season away from the backcountry. I never returned to Glacier, but I think about it constantly. And I think about what Christy said when she left the hospital. She leaned close and spoke quietly, away from the nurses and orderlies. There's something about that region, she said, something that predates the park. The indigenous people refused to winter at high elevation in those mountains. They stayed lower, came up seasonally. There are old stories about things in the high forest, things that hunted, things that were patient. You believe me, I said. I believe that something happened to you, she said carefully. Whether it was what you experienced or what you perceive having experienced, I don't know. But I believe something is happening in those mountains. Since leaving the hospital, I've researched. I've found records. Between 1920 and 1990, 23 people disappeared in Glacier National Park in circumstances that were never fully explained. Missing hikers, rangers whose bodies were never found, researchers who left equipment behind and vanished. Each case was filed, documented, and then allowed to settle into the archives. The disappearances peaked in winter. In the months of November through March, when the park was nearly empty, when isolation was deepest. I live in Kalispell now, the town where the ranger station operates. Sometimes, I can see the mountains from my apartment. When winter comes, when the snow reaches up to the higher elevations and the temperature drops, I feel a pull, a calling from that direction. I know what it is now. It's the hunger. The same hunger that pressed against my window. The same hunger that lives in the lakes and breathes through the forest. It touched me when I was at the cabin, marked me, made me part of its reach even across all the distance I've created. Sometimes I wonder if it let me go. If the evacuation wasn't rescue but release, a way of letting it extend its reach beyond the mountains and into the towns below. Sometimes I wonder if the thing I experienced was actually leaving me at all, or if it simply changed form, became something less visible but no less present. When I have nightmares, I'm back at the cabin. The fire is out, the cold is coming in, and outside the window, something is waiting for the darkness to deepen. Something patient, something that measures time and seasons the human calendar doesn't recognize. The winter that never ends. For the thing in Glacier is all seasons. Every moment is the moment of hunger. Every place is the place where it feeds. And somewhere in those mountains, people are still walking out to the lake. Still discovering what lies beneath the ice. Still adding themselves to the collection that surfaces sometimes when the water freezes and clears. I came to the mountains to disappear from the world I'd known. I succeeded. But what I didn't understand is that the world I disappeared into was far older than anything I could have constructed as escape. The job was to maintain the cabin. I maintained it. Maintained it as a collection point for the thing that lives in the land itself. The thing that is the land itself. And in some part of my mind, deeper than thought, I know I'll go back. When winter comes fully, when the snow piles high enough to isolate me completely, I know I'll find myself driving north. I know I'll find myself on that mountain road. I know I'll find myself walking back to Raven Lake, not because I want to, but because hunger, once acknowledged, becomes contagious, and what was inside the cabin has made a home inside me. The forest is waiting, the winter is waiting, and the hunger, patient and eternal, is waiting to complete what it started the day I chose isolation and found instead the truth of what hungers in the mountains. I came to Glacier to disappear. I succeeded far more completely than I ever intended. My name is Cota Redwater, and I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 4 years. People ask me all the time why I chose this work, why I chose isolation. The honest answer isn't romantic. It's simply this. I needed to disappear. I worked as a wildlife biologist in Denver before Glacier, studying predator-prey dynamics in controlled environments. Clean work, papers published, conferences attended. But in 2019, I made an error in data interpretation that went unnoticed for 2 years. When it surfaced, the fallout was swift and professional. I wasn't fired, technically. I was encouraged to step back, reassess. The academic world closed its doors without slamming them. That's when I applied to become a ranger. It seemed logical. I had the credentials, I had the background. What I didn't have was a reason to stay in the city anymore. My ex-wife was already gone. My parents had their own lives. The mountains felt like the only honest option left. The cabin assignment came 6 months after my hire. Redfish Lake Station, they called it. A 2-room structure built in the 1970s, solar-powered, with a satellite phone that worked approximately half the time. No running water except what I could pump from the well, no electricity beyond the panels. It sat 3 miles from the nearest marked trail, accessible only by a rough service road that turned into mud slurry after rain. My supervisor, Melanie, warned me it was quiet, isolated. She used the word remote like it was a personality trait. But quiet was what I wanted. Quiet meant I didn't have to perform being normal. Quiet meant I could watch the wilderness without anyone watching me. The cabin overlooked Redfish Lake, a body of water so still on calm mornings that the reflection created a visual lie about the world. 2 realities stacked on top of each other. I never thought about how long you could keep lying to yourself before the lie consumed you. That first summer was exactly what I'd hoped for. I maintained the trails. I cataloged wildlife. I responded to the occasional lost hiker with professional competence and private relief. Humans rarely came to this section of the park. The crowds preferred the photogenic valleys, the accessible peaks. Here, at the park's edge, the terrain was steep and unwelcoming. The weather changed without warning. The forest had a way of pressing in on you. I'd walk the perimeter of my assigned area every morning before dawn, checking for deadfall, animal sign, damage from the previous night's weather. The work gave my days structure. The repetition became meditative. By autumn, I'd stopped thinking about Denver entirely. That September, I noticed something off about the elk. It wasn't dramatic, nothing you could photograph or report officially. But during my rounds, I found them clustered in unusual places. They'd moved from their normal grazing areas near the lake's north side to denser forest. When I approached, they didn't scatter in the normal way. Instead, they'd stand very still, watching me with an intensity I'd never seen before. I made a note in my log. Unusual behavioral pattern. Possible disease vector worth monitoring. But I didn't file a report. Something told me not to. By late September, every elk in my territory had moved away from the lake entirely. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke in October. I spent my evenings doing what rangers in isolation do. I read. I maintained my equipment. I wrote entries in journals that no one would ever read. The government radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other stations. Most nights, the park's silence was nearly absolute. It was on a Thursday in late October when I found the first one. The cabin has a wide porch facing the lake. I'd built a fire pit in front, created a sitting area with 2 Adirondack chairs left by previous rangers. That evening, I sat outside with coffee, watching the light change. October in the mountains is beautiful in a way that feels almost aggressive. The colors are too vivid. The cold comes too suddenly. Everything is dying and magnificent simultaneously. I was watching a raven work the shoreline when I noticed the prints. At first, I thought I'd missed them during that morning's rounds, but that was impossible. I walked every inch of the visible perimeter daily. These prints were fresh, made sometime during the afternoon. They came from the forest, crossed the cleared area in front of the cabin, and led to the lake's edge. Just one set. Single file. They ended at the water. I brought a flashlight down to examine them properly. They were bipedal. That was the first thing that struck me. Not an animal gait, not quadrupedal. 2-legged tracks, each about 13 inches long, 5 distinct toes with what looked like claws or nails. The depth was unusual. Whatever made these was heavy, solid. The weight distribution suggested muscular legs, the kind built for powerful strides. I've spent years studying animal sign. Bear tracks have distinct characteristics. Mountain lions walk in a straight line, placing hind feet almost exactly in the prints of their front feet. But this was different. The stride was too long. The foot structure was all wrong for anything in the Northern Rockies ecosystem. I photographed them with my phone, documenting the location and angle. Then I did something I'd never done before. I destroyed them. I used my boot to scuff and scatter the prints, obliterating every clear impression. I told myself it was to prevent hysteria, to avoid triggering unnecessary searches or investigation. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want to share this. I didn't want witnesses or official interest. I didn't want anyone else to know something was wrong. That night, I locked the cabin doors for the first time since arriving in the mountains. The window facing the lake has a crack that I never bothered fixing. That night, I sat in bed and stared out through it, watching the moonlight play across the water. The lake was silver black, that particular color of deep water under partial moon. Still, completely still. I thought about the elk, all of them gone. I thought about the tracks, and how they'd come from the forest and gone to the water like whatever made them was thirsty. I thought about the abandoned prints, how they'd ended abruptly at the shore, as if whatever walked them had simply waded into the dark water and kept going. Around 2 a.m. I heard the first sound. It came from the lake. A low sound, almost subsonic, like wind through a damaged structure. I sat up. The sound continued, irregular and wrong, not quite mechanical, not quite organic, something between the two. I waited for it to resolve into something I could identify. A moose call. A mechanical sound from a neighboring property. Something rational, but it never did. It just continued. This sound like something breathing through a damaged throat, coming from the black water beyond my line of sight. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the porch with a spotlight in my .44 Magnum, watching the lake as it shifted through the hours toward dawn. Nothing emerged, nothing changed, but the sound continued sporadically until the first light began to wash away the night sky. When morning came fully, the sound stopped. The lake was quiet, normal, beautiful. I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it, but I knew better. Something had changed at Redfish Lake. Something had crossed some invisible boundary between the wild I understood and a wild I didn't. It had left tracks, it had made sounds, it had sent every animal in the territory fleeing into the deep forest, and it was still out there. I couldn't report this. Not yet. The moment I filed an official report, the situation would spiral beyond my control. Rangers would come, game wardens, biologists, curious media. The cabin would lose its isolation. My life of quiet would be replaced with questions and investigation, so I did what every person who encounters something impossible does. I documented it privately. I watched more carefully. I told myself I could handle this. I told myself that understanding the situation was the first step toward managing it. I didn't realize yet that some things can't be managed. Some things don't stop until they've taken what they came for. By November, there were rules I'd created without consciously deciding to create them. I didn't go to the lake after dark. I kept a flashlight in every room. I started sleeping with the .44 on the bedside table, loaded. I moved my cot away from the windows. The prints appeared sporadically, sometimes at the water's edge. Once, near the fuel storage shed 50 yards from the cabin. The most disturbing occurrence was when I found a set leading directly to the cabin's back door, where they stopped as if something had stood there, pressed against the wood, long enough to leave a deep impression. I'd been inside that door. In the morning light, the day after finding those prints, I examined the door frame carefully. The lock was simple, the kind designed for keeping weather out, not intruders in. The wood around it was old, soft in places. It would take no effort to force. I bought a new lock in Kalispell on my monthly supply run, telling the hardware store clerk I was just doing maintenance on the cabin. He didn't ask questions. People don't. We accept isolation without investigating what isolation might attract. The prints never came back to the door after I changed the lock, but the sounds did. They became regular. Always at night. Always from the direction of the lake or the deep forest to the north. Sometimes they were almost like calls, the kind of communication animals use to find each other in the dark. Other times they were just sounds of movement, heavy things pushing through underbrush. Large frames finding their way through the dense forest. I began a detailed log. I know how this sounds, a ranger documenting evidence of something impossible, but I wasn't ready to admit that's what I was doing. I called it biological field observation, animal behavior notes, data collection. What I was actually doing was building a case for something that couldn't exist, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge that case to anyone else. The elk's behavior became the most troubling part. They were gone from my territory. Completely gone. In 4 years at Glacier, I'd never experienced anything like the absence. I'd studied predator-prey dynamics. When a top predator moves into an area, prey populations decrease gradually. But this was different. This was flight, complete abandonment. In the second week of November, I found one of them. The elk was a young bull, maybe 3 years old. It was dead on the trail that led toward Black Bear Pass, approximately 1.5 miles north of the cabin. There was nothing obvious about what had killed it. No bite marks, no visible wounds. Just a dead animal that had collapsed where it stood, its body already in the early stages of decomposition. I examined it thoroughly. Blood chemistry, muscle tone, the position of the carcass, everything suggested the animal had simply stopped. The heart had stopped, the lungs had stopped. Like something had reached inside and switched off the mechanism that kept it alive. I buried it as deeply as I could without equipment, covered the remains with rocks, marked a GPS point in my private files. The elk hadn't been there during my morning rounds. That same night, the sounds from the lake were different. Not calls, not movement. Something that might have been laughter if laughter could be articulated by a throat not designed for human phonetics. Wet, gurgling, barely recognizable as anything living. I spent that night on the porch again, alone with the darkness and my flashlight and my thoughts of what the elk had felt in its final moments. November deepened. The temperature dropped below freezing every night. The first snow came early, a wet, heavy snow that melted during the day but began to accumulate steadily. The forest transformed into something more impenetrable. The tracks appeared in the snow now, easier to spot, harder to deny. I photographed them all, different locations, different times, but the pattern was consistent, always bipedal, always enormous. The weight distribution always wrong for anything in my taxonomic knowledge. By mid-November, I was sleeping perhaps 2 hours a night. The radio crackled with ranger chatter from other stations, normal conversations, traffic accidents, a lost hiker near Gunsight Pass, a bear warning at Sia Creek. The world beyond the cabin continued operating under the assumption that the world made sense. I stopped responding to radio calls unless absolutely necessary. I found the second dead animal on November 16th. This time it was a mule deer, a doe, lying in the forest near the old fire ring at North Lake Overlook. Same condition, no visible cause. Just a body that had ceased living in the middle of the forest. And then I found the cabin. It wasn't on any map. Not on my official territory map, anyway. I discovered it by accident, following a deer trail north into the territory I was supposed to monitor but hadn't fully explored yet. The forest was dense there, the underbrush thick, but the trail was clear, worn by repeated passage. The cabin was small, older than mine, possibly from the 1960s. The door hung open, the windows were broken. Inside I found a bed, a wood stove, a table with 3 legs, and a journal. I shouldn't have read the journal. Everything in my mind insisted that opening it would be violation of someone's privacy, intrusion into something I wasn't meant to see. But I opened it anyway. The handwriting was shaky, deteriorating as the entries progressed. The dates began in August of the previous year. Someone had been living in this cabin alone. A ranger, male, named Garrett. The first entries were cheerful, standard observations, the weather, the wildlife, trail conditions. But as I read deeper, the tone shifted. By September, there were mentions of unusual animal behavior. By October, there were descriptions of sounds. The last entry was dated November 3rd. The handwriting was barely legible, the words barely coherent. But I made out the essential part. It comes at night, not animal, not human. It wades the lake and walks the forest. The elk know, they're leaving. The birds know, the forest knows. I think it came because I was alone. I think it's drawn to solitude. I think it's hunting me, but not for meat, for something else, for something I can't name. I'm going to try to leave tomorrow. I'm going to walk out of this territory and not stop until I reach the park boundary. I should have left weeks ago. I should have reported this, but if I report it, they'll think I'm insane. I have to go. I have to get out. There was no entry for November 4th or any day after. I sat in that abandoned cabin and felt something crystallize in my chest. A cold certainty. The knowledge that whatever was in this territory had done this before, that Garrett had been here, that Garrett had heard the sounds, that Garrett had seen the tracks, and that Garrett had either fled in successful escape or had simply stopped coming back. I made copies of the journal pages, not to share, not to report, just to have proof that I wasn't experiencing a solitary delusion. Someone else had witnessed this. Someone else had tried to document it. Someone else had been terrified. That night, I changed my entire approach to the situation. I stopped hiding the terror. I stopped pretending this was a manageable problem I could document my way through. I started preparing. I bought enough supplies at Kalispell for 3 months of isolation. I doubled my ammunition order. I drove out to a supply warehouse in Missoula and purchased a large safe, professional-grade locks for both doors, reinforced window bars that I could install without major construction. The hardware store clerk asked if I was worried about robbery. I told him I was worried about bears. He didn't believe me, but he didn't ask questions. By late November, the cabin had been transformed into something more like a bunker. I'd reinforced the doors, installed the bars on the windows, added a new lock to the back entrance. I'd run motion sensor lights on all 4 sides of the building. I'd moved the bed to the interior room, the smallest space with the fewest points of entry. The supplies were stacked along the walls. Water, canned goods, ammunition, medical supplies, everything I thought I might need if I had to defend myself against something I couldn't define. I was preparing for siege, and I knew with a certainty that transcended logic or reason that this was exactly what was coming. The thing at Redfish Lake was testing the boundaries. It was learning my territory, it was learning my routines, and it was growing closer to the cabin with each passing night. The first attack came on November 27th. I was inside, locked up, running on coffee and adrenaline. The motion lights had been triggering sporadically all afternoon. Just animals, I thought. Deer, maybe a moose passing near the perimeter, but the pattern was odd. Too frequent, too deliberate. I was sitting at the table, eating canned stew straight from the container, when the scratching began. It was at the northeast window, where I'd installed bars. Not frantic, not desperate, just steady, methodical scratching. The sound of something with claws or nails finding the gaps between the bars and testing for weakness. I grabbed the flashlight and approached the window. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The thing was too large to fit properly in the frame. What I could see was a portion of an arm. Long, thin in a way that suggested corded muscle beneath stretched skin. The fingers were elongated, with claws that looked closer to animal talons than anything else. The nails were dark, almost black, and they were dragging across the bars with a sound like metal on metal. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing, heavy breathing from something with a large chest cavity, something designed for endurance or strength or both. I kept the flashlight on the window but didn't move closer. My hand went to the .44 on my hip. The gun felt small suddenly. Inadequate. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing happened. The breathing continued. The thing remained partially visible, a portion of a limb that shouldn't exist, appendages that violated basic mammalian anatomy. Then it moved. The arm withdrew. I heard heavy footsteps moving across the porch, the sound of the other door being tested. The thing was trying every point of entry simultaneously, and from its pattern of movement, it seemed to understand the concept of doors and locks. It understood barriers. That was when I realized how much danger I was actually in. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct. This was something intelligent, something that could problem solve, something that wanted something specific, and the way it moved suggested it had experience getting what it wanted. The noise moved to the back door. The new lock I'd installed was tested. I heard the door rattle against its frame. Then came the sound that will stay with me forever. A voice. Not quite human, closer to human than the other sounds had been, but fundamentally wrong. The vocal cords producing language, or something close to language. Words I didn't recognize but understood on some primal level to be words. It was trying to communicate. I don't know why I opened the window, but I did. It was a small window, and I'd installed bars, but I opened it from the inside and spoke into the dark. "What do you want?" My voice sounded small, weak. The response came immediately. That voice again. Long. Guttural. Something like air being pushed through an instrument not designed for human speech. But underneath it, I heard a word. Clear as glass. My name. It knew my name. I slammed the window shut and locked it. My hands were shaking. My breath was coming too fast. The thing had spoken my name in a voice that sounded almost like it was mimicking human speech, but the grammar was wrong, the phonetics distorted. It was like hearing your name filtered through water, through distance, through something fundamentally alien. The testing of the doors continued for another hour. The voice called out again. Different words. Some almost recognizable. Some not words at all, just sounds that the throat produced. It was learning. It was trying to understand how human language worked, how to shape its own apparatus to produce what humans would recognize as words. Around midnight it stopped. The silence was worse than the sounds had been. I sat in the center room, the loaded .44 in my lap, and waited for dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I sat in the dark and listened to the wind and tried to convince myself that I wasn't going to die in this cabin. When the first light came, the thing was gone. The porch was empty. The yard around the cabin showed nothing but normal forest activity. Tracks in the frost, but they were old. From earlier, not fresh. I opened the doors and emerged carefully. The motion lights had been activated at least 30 times during the night according to the counter I'd installed. 30 separate events, each one probably an approach, each one a test. It had walked the entire perimeter of the cabin during the darkness. The scratches on the window bars were visible in the morning light. Deep scratches. Some of the metal was gouged. The bars were designed to withstand a break-in. I wasn't sure they would withstand another night of that level of focused effort. I made the decision then. I was leaving. Not just the cabin, not just the territory. I was leaving the park entirely. I would drive to Kalispell, file a report in person, and explain everything. Whatever happened after that, whatever questions followed, was better than staying in this cabin and waiting for the thing to learn exactly how to breach the doors. I packed quickly, just essentials. The journal from the abandoned cabin, my documents, my notes. I left the .44 loaded on the table. I was taking my service pistol and nothing else. I didn't lock the cabin doors behind me. The drive to Kalispell took 3 hours. The whole way I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road, the autumn forest, the normal world sliding past the windows. I drove directly to the ranger station. Melanie was there. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Keitha, what happened? You look like..." She didn't finish. She just gestured at me, at my appearance. I was still in my dirty clothes from 2 days of not changing. I hadn't showered in a week. My hands had a tremor that I couldn't control. "I need to file a report," I said. "And I need to tell you everything." What followed was probably the longest conversation of my professional life. I told her about the tracks, about the sounds, about the dead animals, about Garrett's cabin and his journal, about the attack on the cabin itself. Melanie listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you understand how this sounds?" she said finally. "Yes," I said. "I do, but it's true." "Did anyone else see these things?" "No. Just me." "And the animals left the territory?" "Every elk. Most of the deer. The birds changed their patterns." "Keitha." She was speaking like she was trying to explain something to someone who wasn't understanding. "Animals don't do that. There's no predator in North America that would cause that kind of complete behavioral shift." "There is now," I said. "Something is in that territory." Melanie stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the parking lot for a long time before she spoke again. "I'm going to have to report this. We have protocols for potential threats in the park. If there's something dangerous in the wildlife population, we have to investigate." "I know," I said. "You understand they won't believe you?" "I know," I said again. She turned back to me. Her expression was complicated, not dismissive, not fully believing, just tired. "Go home," she said. "Get some rest. We'll send someone out to the cabin tomorrow to investigate." "Don't," I said. "Don't send anyone there. We have to." "Whatever is out there," I said carefully. "It doesn't attack in the daylight. It's nocturnal. But it's also intelligent. It learns. And if rangers start investigating, it will know. It will understand that the cabin is no longer my territory alone." "You're not making sense." "I know," I said. "But please, don't send anyone until you have to." She didn't respond, but she also didn't promise to follow my request. I left the station and found a motel room. I showered for an hour. I slept like I'd been drugged. When I woke up, it was dark, and I couldn't remember where I was. For several panicked moments, I thought I was still in the cabin. Then I remembered. Kalispell. Safety. The normal world. The next morning, I received a call from Melanie. "We went out to the cabin," she said. "Your cabin, just a drive-by. We didn't approach." My heart dropped. "What did you find?" "Nothing," she said. "The cabin is intact. The perimeter is clear. The motion lights you installed are all functioning." "What about the tracks? Did you see any tracks?" There was a pause. "Yes," she said finally. "We saw something. Not fresh tracks. Old ones. But they were unusual." "How unusual?" "The kind of thing we're going to have a wildlife expert examine. There's a biologist from the University of Montana coming out to the cabin tomorrow. He's going to spend a few days surveying the area." My stomach twisted. "Tell him not to stay at the cabin after dark." "I'll make a note of the unusual animal behavior," she said, which wasn't an agreement. "Melanie, please. Tell him to leave before sunset. She hung up. I spent the day in the motel room, unable to settle, unable to eat. That night, I turned on the news hoping for distraction. Instead, I found it. A breaking story from Glacier National Park. A visiting biologist, name of Dr. Marcus Reinhardt, had been found deceased near a cabin in the park's remote northern section. Cause of death was still under investigation. Foul play was not suspected, but authorities were asking for anyone with information to contact the Park Service. The cabin was Redfish Lake Station. The body was found in the morning, when a ranger came to check on him. It was in the forest near the cabin, approximately 30 yards from the building. The position of the body suggested the biologist had fled the cabin during the night. He didn't get far. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and understood with horrible clarity that bringing investigators had not changed anything. It had only added another body to the forest. The official report listed Dr. Reinhardt's cause of death as cardiac arrest. Massive myocardial infarction. The autopsy found no evidence of trauma, poisoning, or foreign substances in his system. He was simply found in the forest with his heart stopped. They didn't mention the condition of the body, but I learned later, through back channels and rumors from other rangers, that there were peculiarities. The body was found in what appeared to be a position of extreme stress, muscles contracted, tendons standing out like rope. The expression on the face was one of terror so profound it couldn't be described in official language. The cabin was sealed, posted with warning signs. The entire northern section of the park was closed to backcountry hiking. Officially, it was for wildlife management purposes. Unofficially, rangers understood that something had happened that couldn't be explained and therefore shouldn't be investigated further. Melanie offered me a transfer to another station. I accepted it immediately. The new location was the east side of the park, far from Redfish Lake, far from the forest where the thing had learned my name. I was reassigned to easier territory, lower elevation, more tourist foot traffic. I understood it was a kind of punishment. An acknowledgement that I was being moved away from the real work because of the incident with Dr. Reinhardt. I didn't argue. I didn't dispute the logic. Getting away from Redfish Lake was all that mattered. But the thing I learned over the following weeks was that my own safety wasn't guaranteed. Just because I'd left the territory didn't mean the territory was done with me. The incidents began small. A photograph appeared in my new cabin, tucked under the door. It was a picture I'd taken of myself back at Redfish Lake, standing on the porch. I'd never printed it. I'd only stored the digital file on my personal laptop. Somehow, a physical copy had been made and left for me to find. Then there were the calls on the satellite phone. At first, just static. Then breathing. Then that voice, the one that had called my name from the darkness outside the original cabin. It said things, strings of words that almost made sense but didn't quite. References to places I'd been, descriptions of things I'd thought. Information that no one else could possibly know. I reported the calls to the phone company. They found nothing abnormal. No unauthorized users, no external tampering. The calls continued. I started eating in my car and sleeping in hotels in town. I was afraid to be in the cabin, afraid to be alone in enclosed spaces where I couldn't guarantee my own safety. The fear was becoming all-consuming. It was affecting my job. It was affecting my ability to function. By early December, I was falling apart. I made the decision to talk to a therapist, not through the Park Service, private, confidential, someone I could tell about the possibility that I was experiencing a psychotic episode. Dr. Susan Voss was a psychiatrist in Kalispell. She listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I was done, she asked if I'd be willing to be evaluated for stress-induced hallucinations. I'm not hallucinating, I told her. It's real. Then why are no other rangers experiencing what you're experiencing? Because they're not in the territory. Because it's focused on me. Why would something that doesn't exist be focused on you specifically? I didn't have a good answer for that. She prescribed medication, anti-anxiety, sleep aids, antipsychotics. I filled the prescriptions and took them religiously. For a few weeks, the terror receded. The calls stopped. The intrusive thoughts lessened. Then it started again. This time, the evidence was physical in a way that couldn't be dismissed as psychological. I woke up one morning and found my apartment had been entered. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But my things had been moved, books rearranged on the shelf, my laptop repositioned on the desk. The bed sheets changed to a different set while I was asleep in them. I'd locked the door. I'd installed new locks myself. And still, something had come inside while I slept and rearranged my life as a statement. A message. A demonstration of power. I called the police. They found no signs of forced entry. They suggested the possibility that I'd moved things myself during the night, that my medications might be causing sleepwalking episodes. When I insisted that was impossible, they exchanged glances and wrote down their official observations. By winter solstice, I was in a state of complete decompensation. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't sleeping. I was alternating between clarity and dissociation, between moments when I was absolutely convinced something supernatural was hunting me and moments when I was equally convinced I was insane. I did something that I knew was a mistake, but I did it anyway. I drove back to Redfish Lake, not to the cabin. I didn't park at the cabin or even approach it. I parked at a trailhead about a mile away and hiked into the forest in the early morning light. The intention was just to observe the area, to confirm that the territory still existed, that my memories of the place weren't fabrications created by my damaged mind. The forest was exactly as I remembered it. The lake was exactly as I remembered it. The cabin was visible in the distance, intact. The motion lights I'd installed still functioning, but something about the forest itself had changed. The trees seemed darker somehow, the undergrowth thicker. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been reorganized in my absence, as if the thing at the lake had conducted a restructuring of space itself. I stood at the edge of the forest and felt it. A presence, not visible, not audible in any conventional sense, but tangible in the way that large predators make their presence known. An awareness of being watched, cataloged, remembered, and then I heard it. Not the voice, not the breathing, but the sounds of movement, heavy footsteps, deliberate, coming toward my location through the forest. I didn't run. I couldn't have run. I just stood there at the trail's edge and waited as the sounds grew closer. The branches began to move. Something large was pushing through the underbrush. Then I saw it. Not all of it, just a portion, an outline, the shape of something humanoid but wrong, proportions that made my brain rebel against accepting what the eyes were reporting. It was moving through the trees with the ease of something native to that specific forest. Our eyes met. I can't adequately describe what happens when you make eye contact with something that isn't supposed to exist. There's a moment of absolute clarity where all the explanations and rationalizations collapse. This thing was real. It was here. It was looking at me with an intelligence that was far older and far colder than human consciousness. And it smiled, or something like a smile occurred on a face that wasn't entirely a face. The expression was one of satisfaction, recognition, ownership. I did run then. I made it back to the car in a time I wouldn't have thought possible. I drove away from Redfish Lake without stopping, without thinking about anything except the need to get distance between myself and whatever that thing was. I drove straight to the hospital. I spent the next 3 months in psychiatric care. The first month was intensive observation in a locked unit. The second month was group therapy, medication adjustment, and the gradual resumption of basic self-care. The third month was outpatient counseling and the slow reconstruction of my ability to function. The official diagnosis was severe anxiety disorder, with features of paranoid delusion brought on by occupational stress. The psychiatrist treating me was kind but firm. The things I'd experienced in the forest didn't happen. The being I'd seen at Redfish Lake was a manifestation of stress and trauma. The intrusion into my apartment was a false memory. The calls on the phone were misinterpretations of ordinary sound. I was being given an out. The Park Service was willing to accept a medical discharge. I could walk away from this with a pension with professional references that didn't mention the incident, with the possibility of rebuilding my life somewhere that didn't involve wilderness or isolation or the kind of conditions that had supposedly triggered the episode. I took the discharge. I took the pension. I left the mountains. I've been living in Portland for 8 months now. I work in a bookstore. I go to therapy twice a week. I take my medications. I'm participating in the world in what might be considered normal ways. But I know what I saw. And more troubling than that, I know it didn't let go. The calls resume every month or so, always from random numbers. Always that voice, learning new words, new ways to articulate its strange version of human language. The intrusions into my apartment have resumed. Small things, a book moved, a mug repositioned. The slow, patient demonstration that no lock, no distance, no amount of geographic separation creates meaningful safety. I've tried to reach out to Garrett, the ranger whose cabin I found. I've made inquiries through official channels. As far as anyone knows, Garrett successfully left his assignment and transferred to a different park. He doesn't respond to my messages. Either he's chosen to completely sever contact with his past, or the thing that was in the forest got him after all. Dr. Reinhardt's death remains officially unexplained. A curious incident filed away in the park's records. No further investigation was conducted. The cabin at Redfish Lake remains sealed, the territory officially closed to backcountry travel due to wildlife management concerns. I know the truth is simpler, they've contained the problem by closing it off. As long as no one goes to the lake, the thing can remain undisturbed. As long as no rangers are stationed in that territory, there are no witnesses. The wilderness can keep its secrets if it's left alone to keep them. But what I've come to understand, what keeps me awake at 3 a.m. in my Portland apartment, is this. The thing doesn't stay in the wilderness anymore. It learned to mimic human speech by listening to me. It learned to move through the world by following me. And most important, it learned that isolation makes you vulnerable. It learned that human beings will eventually reach a breaking point where the fear overwhelms the survival instinct. I destroyed my career to get away from it. I surrendered my location to psychiatric documentation. I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on therapy and medications trying to convince myself and others that it was all in my head. But it's not in my head. It's in the gaps between heartbeats. It's in the space between waking and sleeping. It's in the forest and the city and every place in between. Learning, studying, waiting for the moment when I'm finally alone enough and tired enough that the doors I've built stop mattering. The calls are more frequent now. Sometimes it doesn't say anything. It just breathes. Other times it speaks my name, over and over, practicing the word until the pronunciation becomes flawless. I know exactly what it's doing. It's preparing itself. It's building a version of me in its mind, a map of my fears and weaknesses and the specific vulnerabilities of the human nervous system. And when it's done building that map, when it's learned enough through the calls and the intrusions and the careful observation, it will come, not to the cabin, not to some isolated location where others might intervene. It will come here. To Portland. To my apartment in the city where 8 million people live in the comfortable belief that the wilderness is something you visit on weekends, that danger exists in carefully delineated territories, that the things that happen in the mountains stay in the mountains, but the thing at Redfish Lake understands something that I only came to understand after it was too late. The wilderness doesn't stay contained. It expands wherever there are people, isolated in their own ways, vulnerable in the spaces between the crowds. I sit in my apartment now and I wait. The locks I've installed are good ones, but I don't think they'll matter. The distance I've put between myself and Glacier National Park is immeasurable, but I don't think it will protect me. And the worst part, the thing that terrifies me most, is that I'm not sure I want it to. Because if the thing that walks in the forests of the world is real, if I'm not insane, if I'm not broken, then everything I've lost has been for a reason. Every burned relationship, every career ended, every moment of isolation and despair has been a conversation between myself and something that refuses to be forgotten. The medication I take at night is supposed to help me sleep, but last night, I didn't take it because I heard something outside my window. Breathing, heavy, patient, learning, and when it called my name, I heard the pronunciation was almost perfect, almost ready, almost time. I'm writing this so that someone will know the truth, even if they don't believe it. Even if they dismiss it as the ravings of someone who experienced a breakdown in an isolated cabin in the mountains. But if you read this, and if you work in those remote territories, and if you ever see something that shouldn't exist, don't do what I did. Don't try to document it. Don't try to live alongside it. Don't believe that distance and time and medical explanations can make it forget. Run, and don't stop running, because once it knows your name, once it speaks it aloud and hears itself say it correctly, you've already lost everything. It's just a matter of time before it comes to collect the rest. My name is Cade Whitmore, and I've been staring at the same stretch of forest for 3 weeks without knowing why something feels fundamentally wrong with it. I took the job at Glacier National Park in October because I needed to disappear. Not the metaphorical kind, the actual kind. My previous career had imploded spectacularly after I reported safety violations at a private security firm. The legal bills came first, then the blacklisting. By July, I was living in my truck outside Missoula, Montana, applying for anything that would let me work alone and far from other people. The National Park Service didn't ask many questions. My background checks came back clean. I had wilderness certification from my time in Alaska. They needed someone willing to handle the backcountry stations during the brutal winter months when most seasonal rangers fled south. The salary was modest, but the cabin was free and there was a lake I could see from the northeast ridge. The cabin sits 11 miles from the nearest road. You reach it on foot or horseback, and in late autumn you don't go back much. My supplies arrive by arrangement, a pack animal brought in every 2 weeks by a retired outfitter who takes the route if the weather permits. By November, even he stops coming. It's just me, the evergreens, and whatever else decides to show up. I didn't have friends to tell about the move. My family had stopped trying to contact me after the second restraining order, not against them, by me, against the company's legal team that wouldn't stop calling. So in early September, I drove to Glacier, collected my paperwork, and walked into the wilderness with 2 years of experience I'd suppressed and a genuine hope I might never have to explain myself to anyone again. The first week was quiet in the way I needed. The cabin was solid, built in 1987, maintained well enough. Old propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, a hand pump for water that drew from the lake itself. Someone had left a logbook dating back 6 years. Previous rangers had written mundane entries. Storm watch, collapsed bridge near Paradise Creek. Saw a grizzly sow with 3 cubs near Lake McDonald. Normal things. The kind of observations you write when your life isn't unraveling. By week 2, I'd established a routine. Mornings involved checking the perimeter, walking the marked trails, assessing storm damage and trail conditions. Afternoons I spent on inventory, maintenance, or in the small office reviewing incident reports and weather updates. Evenings were silent. The lake was the real reason I'd come, though I couldn't have articulated it then. Standing at the cabin's edge with my cup of coffee, watching the water reflect the mountains, I could feel something like peace trying to settle in my chest. It lasted about 3 weeks. The deer appeared on the morning of September 28th. I remember the date because I'd just filled out a week's worth of observation logs. Standard procedure documenting weather, animal sightings, trail conditions. At sunrise, I was at the water's edge, the lake still enough to mirror the peak of Mount Jackson across the valley. The herd came from the western slope, moving through the sparse whitebark pines that dotted the alpine meadow. At first glance, nothing unusual, maybe 15 mule deer, which was typical for that elevation in early fall. They moved toward the lower water sources as the season shifted. I'd seen similar groups every 3 or 4 days, but these ones made me set down my coffee. The movement was wrong. Their gait seemed extended. Too many steps between the bounds that normal deer made. Most animals move with an economy of motion, every muscle working toward efficiency. These moved like they were learning, each limb managing its own trajectory independently. A deer bounds. These ones moved as though multiple smaller things were arguing about direction within a shared body. I watched them approach the lake's edge about 200 yards north of the cabin. They lowered their heads to drink, which was normal. The water was normal. They were shaped like deer, the right proportions, the right color pattern, but their heads, the angle was acute, folded back on the spine almost like a bird's. When a mule deer drinks, the ears stay alert, rotating toward any sound. These creatures held their ears flat against their skulls, and when they rotated them, they rotated separately, each one independent, like satellite dishes receiving different signals. I counted the spines visible through their coats. Too many. Vertebrae showing as distinct bumps, more pronounced than the thinning late summer animals I'd expect. The hip bones were sharp enough to cut paper, standing proud beneath matted fur. One of them raised its head and looked directly at the cabin. I've worked enough animal observation to understand that eye contact doesn't always mean what we think it means. A deer sees you, acknowledges threat or safety, and acts accordingly. But this wasn't acknowledgement, this was appraisal. The eye was too round, the pupil too wide and dark. It held my gaze for 8 seconds before it turned back to the water. Malnutrition, I said aloud. My voice sounded thin in the morning air. Parasites. Some kind of degenerative condition. The herd drank for another few minutes. 3 of them raised their heads simultaneously, not in a coordinated way, but in unison, as though responding to a single signal I couldn't hear. They turned together and moved back up the slope, their movements still wrong, the wrongness more obvious now that I was expecting it. I watched them disappear into the tree line. Then I logged the incident in the official record. 15x mule deer observed, unusual behavior pattern, possible disease vector, recommend isolated observation area. I didn't mention that they'd moved like something was learning to be a deer. They came back the next morning. Same herd as far as I could tell. Same numbers, same wrong movement. Same moment where one of them locked eyes with the cabin for far too long. This time, I was ready. I had the binoculars, a camera, and a growing certainty that I should document whatever this was for the regional supervisor's office. The photographs came out blurred. I tried again, 3 times, and each time the images had a quality that made my stomach twist. Not the usual blur of movement, a kind of visual static that made the animals difficult to focus on, as though they didn't quite align with the plane of the photo. Like looking at something moving through dimensions the camera couldn't track. In the binoculars, I could see more detail. The body architecture was fundamentally off. The way the legs attached to the frame, the proportion of the skull, the spine too articulated, the joints too visible, the movement too discontinuous. Cellular degradation, I said to myself. Something eating them from the inside. Parasitic infection, but I was lying, and I knew it. By day 4 there were more of them. I counted 38 animals approaching from different directions, all converging on the lake around dusk. They didn't act aggressive. They didn't seem interested in me specifically. They came to drink, and they moved with that horrifying off-balance gait, and some of them would look toward the cabin with those wide, dark eyes. I called the regional office on the emergency line. "Hey, this is Cade Whitmore at the Glacier Lake Station. I'm reporting unusual wildlife behavior. Multiple mule deer appearing to show signs of infection or neurological degradation. Movement patterns are abnormal. I have photos, but the image quality is compromised. I'm not sure why. I'm wondering if you've had similar reports." The ranger on duty was a woman named Iris who I'd trained with briefly in September. She didn't sound concerned. "Deer act weird all the time, Cade, especially coming into fall. Rutting behavior, territorial aggression, starvation stress. If you think there's a disease vector, photograph what you can and file a report. But honestly, we get calls about strange wildlife every week. Sometimes it's just wildlife." "These aren't acting territorial," I said. "They're coordinated, but not in a normal herd dynamic. And the physical anomalies, malnutrition looks strange when you're used to seeing fat summer animals," Iris said. "Trust me, you're at Glacier Lake for 8 months straight. The isolation plays tricks. I had a ranger out at 2 Medicine think the beavers were organizing a dam project as psychological warfare against him. He was just seeing patterns." She meant it kindly. That made it worse. "Okay," I said. "I'll keep monitoring." "Good. File a report if anything escalates. But Cade, you're doing good work out there. Don't let the quiet spook you." I hung up and looked out at the lake. The light was fading. In the purple dusk, I could see shapes moving through the meadow. At least 20 of them, maybe more, all converging on the water. I went inside and locked the cabin door, which I hadn't done since the first week. October was when things accelerated. The herds came every day now, sometimes multiple times daily. The numbers grew. 40, then 50. Then I stopped counting. They moved through the aspen groves and the meadow with increasing confidence, and every time at least one would stare at the cabin, sometimes more, sometimes for minutes. I logged it all. The official reports became more detailed, my language more precise. I described the physical deformities, the angular spines, the odd proportions, the way their joints seemed to work independently, the behavioral abnormalities, the coordinated timing, the unnatural stillness, the synchronized head movements, the gaze duration, the presence of animals that hadn't been there the previous day, as though they were being added to the population. Iris called back on October 12th. "We got your report," she said. She sounded different, less patient. "Look, we sent photos to the regional biologist. He's saying what I'm saying. It's either disease, malnutrition, or you're looking at animals that aren't actually there." "I'm looking at them with binoculars," I said. "I'm taking measurements. I'm tracking their patterns." "Okay, but here's what he actually said, and I'm reading this directly. If the ranger is unable to obtain clear photographic evidence of the alleged abnormalities, it's likely a combination of poor nutrition, stress response, and perceptual interpretation influenced by isolation and low light conditions." I felt something burn in my chest. "I'm not imagining this." "No one said you were imagining it. But there are 67 ranger stations in Montana, and you're at one of the most remote. 4 months alone with bears and weather and 0 human contact. Your brain is trying to make sense of normal stimulus in abnormal ways. It's not a weakness, it's human." After I hung up, I went through my photos again. She was right about one thing. They were unclear. Even with the best camera and the steadiest hands, the images had that same static quality, a kind of visual noise that made the animals hard to perceive. But in person, with my own eyes, they were perfectly clear. Too clear. On October 18th, Mark Hendricks went missing. He was a ranger from the Belly River Station, about 20 miles north of me. He'd called in that morning saying he was hiking north toward the Gunsight Pass Trail to check for winter damage. He was supposed to return by evening. He didn't. The search protocol began immediately. Iris called me directly. "We need you to conduct observation sweeps from your position," she said. "You have elevation and visibility. Walk the eastern ridge, look for signs of distress, check the slopes for any evidence of a fall or injury. Mark knows this area. He wouldn't get lost, so if he's out there, he's either trapped or hurt." I hiked for 6 hours along the ridge, scanning the valleys, looking for anything out of place. I found nothing. No distress signals, no broken equipment, no mark. But I found the deer. Hundreds of them. They moved through the forest in the valley below with a coordination that made my skin crawl. They weren't hunting Mark. They were simply present, as though his disappearance and their appearance were on some kind of schedule I didn't understand. I reported what I'd seen, minus the detail about the herds. Iris didn't need me projecting my obsession onto a missing person. Mark was found 3 days later, alive, walking out of the northern forest on his own. He didn't make much sense when they picked him up. He kept talking about the deer, about how many there were, about how they surrounded him, about how they didn't attack but they didn't let him move either. He was talking about them circling him in the dark, always just beyond the light from his flashlight, their eyes catching the beam and reflecting it back at him. The official story was that Mark had fallen, hit his head and experienced temporary disorientation and memory confusion. The search and rescue team documented a small laceration on his scalp, consistent with striking a rock. He didn't contradict the narrative, but when I called his station, his colleague mentioned that Mark wasn't coming back. He'd requested a transfer, effective immediately. I understood. Whatever had happened to him out there, he didn't want to stay. By late October, there were roughly 1,000 of them. I don't know how I arrived at that number. I wasn't counting, not exactly. But the meadow in front of the cabin was alive with movement from dawn until full dark. The deer were everywhere now, and they moved with perfect synchronization, as though controlled by a singular intelligence distributed across many bodies. The herds would stand motionless for hours, then shift in perfect unison. Every head would turn the same direction. Every spine would ripple in the same pattern. Every eye would open and close in synchronized rhythm, and they watched the cabin. I stopped going outside except to collect water. I sealed the cabin's south-facing windows with plywood. I kept the rifle loaded not because I believed it would help, but because the weight of it made me feel fractionally less helpless. Iris called with another missing person report on October 27th. This time it was Jennifer Kowalski, a day hiker who'd entered the park through the northern access point. She was supposed to be a quick loop, 4 hours maximum. She hadn't emerged. I didn't volunteer to search this time. Iris didn't ask. But I watched the herds that night, and I saw something different in their movement. A kind of satisfaction. A completion of some cycle I couldn't perceive. Jennifer was found 5 days later, or what was left of her was. The official cause of death was exposure, hypothermia, shock from injuries sustained in a fall. The injuries, according to the regional coroner, were consistent with a tumble down a steep rocky slope. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything other than a tragic accident. But the body was found standing upright, fully dressed in an open meadow where she could have called for help if she'd been conscious. And the search photographs showed something else, deep tracks around the body, hundreds of them, hoof prints arranged in tight concentric circles as though something had been dancing around her while she died. November arrived with early snow and a weight I could barely carry. I'd stopped filing reports. Iris had stopped calling. In their silence, I could feel the collective decision. The ranger at Glacier Lake was experiencing stress-induced psychological disturbance. I was seeing patterns in natural phenomena. I was alone too long, and my perception had become unreliable. So I stopped talking to them, and I paid more attention. The deer, or the things that wore the shape of deer, were changing. Not their bodies, which remained the same impossible architecture of wrong proportions and too many joints. But their behavior was becoming more direct. They pressed against the cabin at night. I could hear them moving on the roof, the sound of hooves on wooden shingles, the settling of weight distributed across the structure. I watched them through the window cracks. The way they moved was becoming more efficient, as though they were learning optimization. The way they looked at the cabin was becoming more evaluative, as though they were calculating something about its integrity. I was documenting everything in my personal journal now, knowing that the official logs would just reinforce the narrative of my decline. I filled 40 pages in 2 weeks. I sketched the animals' movements, diagrammed their patterns, recorded the times they moved, and the weather conditions that seemed to trigger activity. On November 8th, the animals did something new. They stopped avoiding the cabin. Instead, they began a slow, methodical examination. They circled it completely, walking the perimeter with deliberate steps. They tested the doors and windows, not violently, but with a kind of patient exploration. I watched through the cracks as one of them, larger than the others, its spine even more prominent, pressed its face against the glass and looked directly at me. The eye that pressed against the window was dilated, the pupil the size of a thumbprint. I could see into it. I could see something moving in the depth of that eye, something that looked almost like intelligence, almost like hunger. I realized in that moment that whatever these things were, they weren't wild animals. They were something else, something that had learned to wear the form of a deer in the same way I wore my skin. With increasing competence and decreasing restraint, the knock came at midnight. It wasn't an aggressive knock, just a regular knock on the door, the way a visitor would announce themselves. I sat in the cabin's center, the rifle across my lap, staring at the door. The knock came again, polite, patient, then a voice. "Can you let us in?" I didn't respond. The voice sounded almost human, but there was something wrong with the phonetic structure. Too many sounds stacked into a single syllable, a harmony that wasn't harmonic. "We've been waiting," the voice said. "We need to understand how you work." "I'm calling the Park Service," I said. My voice cracked. "They won't help," the thing said. It sounded like it was smiling. "They already know we're here. They've always known. We've been coming to Glacier for longer than Glacier has been a park." The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. Like a child's game, I fired through the door, 3 shots in rapid succession. The rifle's recoil was violent in the enclosed space. The reports were deafening. I was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the weapon. The knocking stopped. For hours, nothing happened. I sat in the dark, listening to the sound of movement around the cabin, the shifting of weight, the scrape of hooves on wood, a sustained, patient exploration of every inch of the structure. By dawn, they had stopped. The herds were retreated to the meadow, arranged in their usual formations. The cabin was intact. The door was still locked. I gathered supplies and climbed out the north window, moving in a crouch, expecting at every moment for the animals to surge toward me. They didn't. They watched, every eye tracking my movement as I fled toward the ridgeline. I hiked for 18 hours without stopping. I made it to the northern trail and flagged down a maintenance crew who was preparing the park for winter closure. I didn't explain what had happened. I said I was sick, that I needed to get out. They brought me down in their truck. Iris met me at the park headquarters in West Glacier. She had the expression of someone who'd expected this. "I'm recommending you for a 3-month psychological evaluation," she said. "Paid leave, full benefits, no mark on your record. You can try again next season if you want." "You know what's in that lake," I said. "You know what's in that forest. I know you've had a difficult few months," Iris said carefully. "I know isolation affects people in ways we can't always predict." Did Mark Hendricks ever explain what happened to him? Mark is no longer a ranger. He's in Boulder working with his wife's family business. As far as his incident report, he experienced traumatic stress, nothing more. "Jennifer Kowalski was found in a perfect circle of hoofprints," I said. "Jennifer Kowalski fell," Iris said, with a firmness that suggested the conversation was ending. The coroner was clear. The tracks were pre-existing, wildlife behavior unrelated to her death. I left the office and went through the paperwork. I was released from my post. My 3 months of leave began immediately. I was given contact information for the psychological evaluator and told to call with any emergencies. But before I left West Glacier, I did something I knew I shouldn't. I went to the public library and accessed the historical archives of the park. The records went back to the 1800s, before formal park designation, and in the ledgers and the reports from early rangers and settlers, there were entries that matched mine exactly. Strange deer behavior in the autumn months, animals behaving in coordinated, unnatural manner, herd movements synchronized in ways inconsistent with known animal behavior, missing hikers, unexplained circumstances. The entries spanned 200 years, different centuries, different seasons, but the same phenomenon, recurring like clockwork, every cycle of years. And then I found something else. A handwritten journal from 1952, left by a ranger named Douglas Venn. His writing was careful, his observations precise. He'd spent an entire season at Glacier Lake Station. He'd documented the same animals I'd seen, and in his final entry he'd written, "I understand now. They're not coming for me. I'm not important. They come for the hikers, the visitors, the people who move through their forest. They're collecting, gathering, the coordinates of the patterns, the places where they stand watching. They form a shape, a circle, a door, and every season, more of them arrive. Every season they learn more about how we work. Every season fewer of us leave to tell what we know. I think they're building something, or maybe they're becoming something. It's hard to tell the difference from inside it. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm going to tell people. I don't know if they'll believe me. I don't know if it matters. but I'm done being present for their education. The entry was dated October 29th, 1952, 70 years ago, almost exactly when I'd first seen the herds. I didn't sleep that night. I drove south toward Missoula and found a motel where I paid cash for a week. I spent the next several days reviewing every available database, every news report, every missing person bulletin from the Glacier National Park region going back 20 years. The numbers were staggering, not dramatically staggering. Glacier wasn't known for being particularly dangerous. But the baseline of missing hikers, the unexplained falls, the people found dead in illogical positions or circumstances, it was higher than the national average, significantly higher, and the seasonal pattern was clear. August through November. Those were the months when the animals were most active. Those were the months when people disappeared. I went to my psychological evaluation. I told Dr. Patricia Esmond what she wanted to hear. Yes, I was experiencing stress-induced perceptual disturbance. Yes, isolation had affected my judgment. Yes, I was willing to engage in therapy and medication management. She seemed relieved. Everyone likes a clean narrative. Everyone prefers the explanation that keeps the world orderly and rational. I never told her what I actually saw. I'm writing this from a small house in Helena. I've been here for 4 months. I took a job with the Forest Service in an administrative capacity. No field work, no solitude, no wilderness assignments. I see Dr. Esmond twice a month. I'm on medication that makes the world feel slightly muffled, which I prefer. But I think about Glacier Lake constantly. I think about those animals. I think about what they're doing right now, in the warming spring, as they begin to congregate again in the meadows and forests. And I think about something Douglas Venn wrote that I didn't include earlier, something I found in the archived journals, in his final week before he left. I've been watching them long enough to understand something. They're not alien, they're not infected, they're not diseased, they're learning, and what they're learning is us. Every visitor who disappears in their forest makes them more efficient. Every hiker they surround teaches them something new about how we move, how we think, how we survive. They're conducting an experiment, and the experiment is about what they could become if they kept collecting, kept learning, kept improving. I think what they're trying to build is us, or something like us, or something that could pass for us well enough to walk out of the forest and into the towns and keep going. And I think they're almost finished learning. When spring comes to Montana this year, people will return to Glacier National Park. Families and couples and solo hikers looking for solitude and beauty. The trails will be busy again, the herds will be waiting, and in the meadow near Glacier Lake, in the aspen groves and the alpine forests, the animals will continue their patient work. They'll continue their coordination and their observation and their slow, methodical compilation of data about how human beings function. They'll continue preparing, and no one will believe the rangers who see them. No one will believe the hikers who escape them. No one will connect the statistics, the missing persons, the unexplained deaths, because the world prefers the story that everything is natural, everything is explainable, everything is under control. I prefer that story too. I'm taking my medication, but I don't go to Glacier anymore, and every autumn, when the season turns and the nights grow long, I find myself unable to sleep. I sit in my small house in Helena and think about the meadow and the lake and the sky full of stars, and I listen for the sound of hooves on my roof, because sometimes I think they learned enough from me. Sometimes I think they understand humans well enough now. Sometimes I think the learning doesn't stop at the forest's edge.